Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most fascinating mysteries. Not a murder mystery, not a treasure hunt, but something even more intriguing. The story of a woman who should be as famous as Anne Boleyn or Elizabeth I, yet somehow history chose to forget her. A woman who had royal blood flowing through her veins, who was imprisoned in the Tower of London not once, not twice, but 4 times. A woman who survived 5 Tudor queens, plotted royal marriages, and became the grandmother of a king. And yet, if you ask most people today who Lady Margaret Douglas was, you will be met with blank stares. How does someone so central to the Tudor story simply vanish from our collective memory? Tonight, we are going to uncover that mystery. Now, before we step into the cold November night of 1515, I need a tiny favour from you. If you're settling in for this journey with me, could you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel? Hit that like button if you enjoy deep dives into forgotten history, and maybe share this video with someone who loves a good Tudor tale. And hey, I am genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. Are you cozy in bed or maybe listening while doing dishes? I love hearing from you. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and let us drift back 500 years together. Picture this. It is October of 1515. Not in a grand palace draped in tapestries and gold, not in London, where history usually happens. No. Our story begins in one of the most remote windswept corners of England, a place called Harbottle Castle. If you have never heard of it, you are not alone. Most people have not. It sits right on the border between England and Scotland in Northumberland, a land of rolling hills, stone walls, and constant danger. This was not a safe place to be born. This was a frontier, a no-man's land where English and Scottish raiders fought skirmishes, stole cattle, and settled old feuds with blood. And on one particularly cold night in that fortress, baby girl entered the world. Her mother, Margaret Tudor, was in labour, exhausted, terrified, and far from home. This was not how a queen's childbirth was supposed to go. Margaret Tudor was not just anyone. She was the older sister of King Henry VIII of England, the daughter of Henry VII, and until recently she had been the Queen of Scotland. Yes, you heard that right. The Queen of Scotland. But now she was a fugitive, running for her life, heavily pregnant and giving birth in a castle that was barely more than a military outpost. Why was a queen running? Well, that is where this story gets messy. Margaret Tudor's life had been, let us just say, complicated. She had been married at 13 years old to King James IV of Scotland. It was a political marriage, of course. Her father, Henry VII, wanted peace between England and Scotland, 2 kingdoms that had been enemies for centuries. So, little Margaret was shipped off to Scotland to marry a king who was 16 years older than her. And surprisingly, it was not a terrible marriage. James IV was charming, cultured, loved music and poetry. They had children together. Life was actually decent for a while. But then came Flodden. The year 1513, one of the most catastrophic battles in Scottish history. King James IV decided to invade England, while Margaret's brother, Henry VIII, was off fighting in France. James thought it would be an easy victory. He was wrong, dead wrong. The English forces met the Scots at Flodden Field in Northumberland, and by the end of the day, King James IV and the flower of Scottish nobility lay slaughtered on the battlefield. 10,000 Scots died that day. Imagine the grief that swept through Scotland. Margaret Tudor, who was just 24 years old, suddenly found herself a widow with a baby son, the new King James V, who was only 1 year old. Now, here is where Margaret made the decision that would change everything. In the summer of 1514, barely a year after her husband's death, she remarried. She married Archibald Douglas, the 6th Earl of Angus. He was young, handsome, and according to some sources, Margaret thought he would help her hold on to power as regent for her infant son. But this marriage was a disaster from day one. First of all, the Scottish lords were furious. According to King James IV's will, if Margaret remarried, she would lose her position as regent. And she did. Power was stripped from her hands. Second, Archibald Douglas turned out to be, well, let us be kind and say he was not husband material. He abandoned Margaret almost immediately after their wedding, running off to be with his mistress. Yes, you heard that right. He married the Queen of Scotland and then just left her for another woman. The audacity. So here was Margaret Tudor, betrayed by her new husband, stripped of her power, hated by the Scottish lords, and heavily pregnant with Archibald Douglas's child. And the Scottish lords? They wanted to take her baby away the moment it was born to use as a political pawn. So Margaret did the only thing she could think of. She fled. In the middle of her pregnancy, she escaped from Edinburgh and made a desperate journey south toward England, toward her brother's kingdom, hoping he would protect her. The journey was brutal. We are talking about a pregnant woman in 1515, travelling through hostile territory on horseback, in the rain and cold with a handful of loyal servants. She barely made it. By the time she reached Harbottle Castle, she was exhausted, ill, and going into labour. And there, in that cold stone fortress, on October the 7th, 1515, she gave birth to a baby girl. That baby was Lady Margaret Douglas. Now, think about the symbolism here for a moment. This child was born literally between two kingdoms, England on one side, Scotland on the other, born to a Scottish queen and an English-Scottish earl, born in a castle that was neither fully safe nor fully home. From the very first breath she took, Margaret Douglas existed in a space of ambiguity. She was royal, but not quite a princess. She had a claim to thrones, but no throne to call her own. She was wanted, but also unwanted, loved, but also abandoned. Her mother, Margaret Tudor, tried to keep her safe, but even that was complicated. Baby Margaret was baptised at Harbottle, and then her mother continued fleeing south into England. But here is the heartbreaking part. Archibald Douglas, the father, did not care. He did not come to see his newborn daughter. He stayed in Scotland playing politics, trying to grab power for himself. In fact, for most of Margaret Douglas's childhood, her father was essentially absent. He would show up occasionally, use her as a political bargaining chip, and then disappear again. So who raised this little girl? Well, she was passed around like a royal hot potato. First, she lived with her mother for a while, but Margaret Tudor eventually returned to Scotland, leaving baby Margaret behind in England. Then the little girl was placed in the household of her aunt, Mary Tudor, the Duchess of Suffolk, who was Henry VIII's younger sister. Imagine being a toddler and being raised by your aunt because your mother had to go back to a country where she was fighting for survival. Later, Margaret was moved again, this time to the household of her cousin, Princess Mary, who would one day become Queen Mary I of England, also known as Bloody Mary. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Princess Mary and little Margaret Douglas became close, really close. They were around the same age, both daughters of difficult circumstances, both living under the shadow of King Henry VIII's unpredictable moods. They were companions, friends, almost like sisters, and this bond, it would last their entire lives. Even when Mary became queen, she kept Margaret close, trusted her, gave her positions of honour. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the little girl. What was it like for Margaret Douglas growing up? Well, on the surface, it looked pretty good. She lived in royal households. She wore beautiful clothes. She was educated in music, languages, poetry, all the things a noble lady was supposed to know. She was treated as a princess, even though technically she was not one. The Spanish ambassador even called her the Princess of Scotland, which must have been flattering. but also confusing because she was not really that either. But underneath the surface, there was always this uncertainty. Margaret Douglas had royal blood from both sides. Through her mother, she was the granddaughter of Henry VII, the niece of Henry VIII. Through her father, she was connected to powerful Scottish noble families. On paper, she had a claim to both the English and Scottish thrones, and that made her valuable, but it also made her dangerous. You see, in Tudor England, being close to the throne but not on it was one of the most dangerous positions you could be in. Henry VIII was paranoid about rivals. He had already executed people for having royal blood and ambitions. And here was Margaret Douglas, a young woman with a legitimate claim to the succession, living right under his nose. She had to be very, very careful. And here is the thing that most people do not realize. Margaret's childhood shaped her into one of the most politically savvy women of her generation. She learned early that survival meant knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. She learned that loyalty to the king was everything. She learned that love and marriage were not about romance. They were about power, and she learned that sometimes the only way to win the game was to play it better than everyone else. But she also learned something else, something sadder. She learned that being royal did not mean being loved. Her mother, Margaret Tudor, barely saw her. Her father, Archibald Douglas, ignored her. Her uncle, King Henry VIII, was kind to her sometimes, but his kindness was always conditional, always dependent on whether she was useful to him. And her cousins, the royal children, were her friends, but they were also her competitors in the great game of succession. So here is the question I want you to think about as we close this first chapter. Why is Margaret Douglas forgotten? She was born into one of the most dramatic moments in Tudor history. She survived a childhood of abandonment and uncertainty. She grew up alongside future queens. She had royal blood, beauty, intelligence, and ambition. So why do we remember Anne Boleyn, who was queen for only 3 years? But we forget Margaret Douglas, who lived through 5 reigns and shaped the course of British history. I think part of the answer is this: history loves tragedy more than it loves survival. Anne Boleyn was executed, so she became a martyr, a symbol. Margaret Douglas, she survived, she endured, she played the long game, and somehow, in the eyes of history, that is less exciting. We remember the women who died dramatically, but we forget the women who lived strategically. But here is the irony. Margaret Douglas's survival, her patience, her scheming ultimately had a bigger impact on history than almost anyone else in the Tudor story. Because of her, because of the choices she made, the alliances she forged, the risks she took, the entire future of the British monarchy was changed. Every British king and queen from James I onward, including Queen Elizabeth II, can trace their lineage back to this woman, this forgotten princess, this survivor. So as we move forward in her story, I want you to keep that in mind. Margaret Douglas was not forgotten because she was unimportant. She was forgotten because she was too good at the game. She survived when others did not. She won when others lost. And history, for some reason, prefers its heroines dead. But we are going to change that. Over the next hours, we are going to walk through her entire life. We are going to see her fall in love, get thrown in the Tower of London, plot royal marriages, lose the people she loved most, and ultimately see her greatest dream come true, even if she did not live long enough to witness it herself. Next, we are going to dive into her childhood in more detail. We are going to see what it was really like to grow up as the daughter nobody wanted, surrounded by queens and kings, yet never quite belonging. We are going to meet the people who shaped her, the tragedies that hardened her, and the moments that taught her how to survive in the most dangerous court in Europe. Trust me, you are not going to want to miss what comes next. So we have set the stage. We have seen how Margaret Douglas entered the world in the most dramatic way possible. Born in a freezing castle on the border between 2 kingdoms, to a mother fleeing for her life. But what happened next? What was it actually like to grow up as this forgotten princess? Because this is where the story gets really interesting, and honestly, really heartbreaking. Imagine being a child and not knowing where home is. Not because you moved once or twice, but because you genuinely did not have a place that was yours. That was Margaret Douglas's entire childhood. From the moment she was born, she was shuffled from household to household, person to person, almost like a package that nobody really wanted to keep for long, but nobody could quite throw away either. Let me paint you a picture of what her first few years looked like. After she was born at Harbottle Castle in October of 1515, her mother, Margaret Tudor, stayed in England for a while trying to recover, trying to figure out what to do with her life. But here is the thing about Margaret Tudor. She was stubborn, incredibly stubborn. Some historians have described her as basically Henry VIII in a dress, which, if you know anything about Henry VIII, is not exactly a compliment. She was impulsive, passionate, and absolutely terrible at making good decisions when it came to men. So what did she do? Well, she eventually went back to Scotland. Yes, you heard that right. She went back to the country where half the nobles hated her, where her husband Archibald Douglas had abandoned her, and where her position as Queen Mother was basically meaningless because she had lost the regency. Why would she do that? Politics, power, pride. She thought she could win back her influence. She thought she could fight for her son, the young King James V, and reclaim her position. But here is the problem. When she went back to Scotland, she left baby Margaret behind in England. The little girl was maybe a year old, maybe 2, and just like that, her mother was gone. Can you imagine that? Your mother, the only person who is supposed to love you unconditionally, just leaves. Sure, she had her reasons. Sure, she thought she was doing what was best. But to a toddler, all of that political maneuvering does not matter. All that matters is that your mother is not there. And her father, Archibald Douglas, well, he was still in Scotland, still playing his political games, still completely uninterested in his daughter. In fact, there are records that show he tried to use Margaret as a bargaining chip in his negotiations with the English crown. But he never once came to visit her, never once wrote her a letter that we know of, never once showed any real affection. He saw her as a tool, not a daughter. So who took care of this little girl? At first she was placed in the household of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Yes, that Wolsey. Henry VIII's chief minister, the most powerful man in England after the king himself. Now, Wolsey was not exactly known for his warm and fuzzy personality. He was brilliant, cunning, ambitious, and he had his hands full running the entire English government. So why did he take in a baby? Well, partly because Henry VIII asked him to, and you did not say no to the king, but also because Margaret Douglas was valuable. Remember, she had royal blood, she was the king's niece, and in Tudor politics, valuable people needed to be watched, controlled, kept close. But Wolsey did not raise her himself, obviously. She was placed with caretakers, nurses, servants. She lived in his household, but she was not exactly part of his family. It was transactional. And then, when Wolsey fell from power in 1529, after he failed to secure Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, guess what happened to Margaret? She was moved again, shuffled to another household, another unfamiliar place. This time she went to live with her aunt, Mary Tudor, the Duchess of Suffolk. Now Mary Tudor was Henry VIII's younger sister, and she was absolutely fascinating. She had been married off as a teenager to the elderly King Louis XII of France, a man who was literally old enough to be her grandfather. The marriage was political, of course, and poor Mary was miserable. But Louis died after only 3 months of marriage, and here is where Mary did something incredibly bold. She secretly married the man she actually loved, Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, without asking her brother Henry for permission. This was scandalous. This was dangerous. Henry VIII was furious. He could have had them both executed for treason, but Mary was his favourite sister, and eventually he forgave them. The point is, Mary Tudor understood what it was like to be a pawn in royal politics. She understood what it was like to have your life controlled by men who did not care about your happiness, and maybe because of that she had some sympathy for little Margaret Douglas. But even living with Aunt Mary was not stable. The household moved around, there were always visitors, courtiers, political intrigues happening in the background. And then Mary Tudor died in 1533, when Margaret Douglas was only 18 years old. So once again, Margaret lost someone who'd been a maternal figure in her life. Once again she was moved. This time she went to live with her cousin, Princess Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And this is where Margaret Douglas finally found something like family. Princess Mary was only about a year younger than Margaret, and the two girls bonded deeply. They were both in incredibly difficult positions. Princess Mary had just been declared illegitimate by her own father. Henry VIII, desperate for a son, had divorced her mother and married Anne Boleyn, and in the process he had ripped Mary's title away. She was no longer a princess, she was no longer heir to the throne. She was just Lady Mary, a bastard in the eyes of the law. Can you imagine how that must have felt? To go from being the most important girl in England to being essentially nobody, overnight? And Margaret Douglas understood that pain. She understood what it was like to be royal but not royal enough, to have a claim but no real power, to be wanted but also unwanted. So the two girls became incredibly close. They studied together, prayed together, whispered secrets to each other late at night. They were both devout Catholics in a court that was rapidly becoming Protestant. They both hated Anne Boleyn, the woman who had destroyed Mary's family. And they both knew what it was like to live under the constant threat of their uncle's unpredictable wrath. There are records of them exchanging gifts, writing letters when they were apart, supporting each other through the darkest times. And this friendship, it lasted their entire lives. When Mary eventually became queen in 1553, she made Margaret Douglas one of her most trusted ladies. She gave her the position of First Lady of the Bedchamber, which was basically the most prestigious role a woman could have at court. She trusted her with secrets, with money, with power, and all of that started in those childhood years when they were just two lonely girls trying to survive in a dangerous world. But let me ask you something, what does a childhood like that do to a person? Think about it. Margaret Douglas grew up without a stable home. Her mother abandoned her, her father ignored her. She was passed from household to household like an unwanted piece of furniture. She watched her cousin Mary get stripped of her title and dignity. She saw what happened to people who fell out of favour with Henry VIII. She lived through the execution of Anne Boleyn, the fall of Thomas Cromwell, the constant churn of wives and ministers and courtiers who are here one day and dead the next. What does that teach you? It teaches you that survival is everything. It teaches you that you cannot trust anyone completely. It teaches you that love is conditional, that power is fleeting, and that the only person you can really count on is yourself. It teaches you to watch, to listen, to calculate. It teaches you when to speak and when to stay silent. It teaches you that in Tudor England, one wrong move could mean the Tower, or worse, the executioner's block. And here is the really tragic part. Margaret Douglas learned these lessons too well. She became so good at playing the political game that she lost parts of herself in the process. She learned to suppress her emotions, to hide her true feelings, to present whatever version of herself was most useful at any given moment. She learned to be a survivor, and yes, that kept her alive. But it also made her lonely. It also made her hard. It also meant that when she finally did fall in love, when she finally did make decisions based on her heart instead of her head, the consequences were catastrophic. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. Right now, we are still in the early 1530s and Margaret is still a teenager. She is living with Princess Mary, learning the rhythms of court life, watching the drama unfold around Anne Boleyn. And speaking of Anne Boleyn, here is where things get really complicated. Because in 1536, Margaret Douglas was appointed as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne Boleyn. Yes, you heard that right. The same Anne Boleyn that she and Princess Mary hated. The same woman who had destroyed Mary's mother and taken the Queen's place. So why would Margaret accept this position? Why would she serve the woman she despised? The answer is simple. Because she had no choice. When the king's wife asks you to serve her, you do not say no. When your uncle is Henry VIII, you do not refuse a position at court. So Margaret swallowed her pride, put on a smile, and joined Anne Boleyn's household. And let me tell you, the timing could not have been worse. Because this was 1536. This was the year everything fell apart for Anne Boleyn. By May of that year, Anne would be arrested, tried for treason and adultery, and executed at the Tower of London. Margaret Douglas had a front row seat to one of the most famous tragedies in Tudor history. She saw the Queen go from the height of power to the depths of despair in a matter of days. She saw how quickly the king could turn on someone he once loved. She saw the machinery of the Tudor court grind Anne Boleyn into dust. And here is the kicker. Just 2 months after Anne Boleyn's execution, Margaret Douglas made the biggest mistake of her life. She fell in love with the wrong man, the worst possible time. And it would land her in the Tower of London with a death sentence hanging over her head. But here is what I want you to understand before we move into that story. Margaret's childhood had set her up for this moment. All those years of abandonment, of instability, of watching love and loyalty get weaponized and destroyed, all of that had created a young woman who was desperate for something real, something that was hers, something that nobody could take away. And when she found that something, she grabbed onto it with both hands, consequences be damned, because maybe, just maybe, if you grow up feeling unwanted your whole life, the moment someone actually wants you, actually chooses you, actually sees you, it does not matter what the price is. You will pay it. Even if that price is your freedom, even if that price is your life. You know what is truly heartbreaking about Margaret's childhood? It is not just that she was unloved. It is that she was almost loved. She had glimpses of what family could be. She had moments with Princess Mary where she felt like she belonged. She had brief periods of stability before everything got ripped away again. And maybe that is worse than never having it at all. Because once you know what it feels like to be wanted, to be safe, to have someone who actually cares whether you live or die, the absence of it becomes unbearable. And that, I think, is the key to understanding everything Margaret Douglas did for the rest of her life. Every decision she made, every risk she took, every scheme she plotted, it all came back to this. She was trying to create the stability and love and family that her childhood had denied her. She was trying to build something that could not be taken away, something permanent, something hers. Of course, in Tudor England, nothing was permanent, nothing was safe, and the harder you tried to hold on to something, the more violently it could be ripped from your hands. Margaret Douglas was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. So what comes next? Well, we are about to enter the most scandalous, most romantic, and most tragic chapter of Margaret's young life. We are going to talk about love in the Tudor court, about poetry and passion and forbidden promises. We are going to meet Lord Thomas Howard, a young man who would capture Margaret's heart and nearly cost her everything. We are going to see how a secret romance turned into a national crisis, how love became treason, and how Margaret Douglas found herself in the Tower of London staring death in the face at only 20 years old. Trust me, you are going to want to hear what happens next. Love in the Tudor court was never simple. It was always tangled up with politics, with power, with danger. But sometimes, just sometimes, two people would look at each other across a crowded room and forget all of that. They would forget the consequences, They would forget the rules. They would forget that in Henry VIII's England, falling in love without permission could get you killed. That is exactly what happened to Margaret Douglas in the summer of 1536. And what makes this story even more tragic, even more beautifully doomed, is that we have evidence of their love. We have their actual words. Poetry they wrote to each other, hidden in a manuscript that somehow survived 500 years. Their voices, frozen in time, whisper across the centuries about a love that was never supposed to happen. Let me set the scene for you. It is June of 1536. Anne Boleyn has just been executed barely a month ago. The court is still reeling from the shock, from the brutality of it all. Henry VIII has already married wife number 3, Jane Seymour, and everyone is walking on eggshells, terrified of making the wrong move, saying the wrong thing, even looking the wrong way. And into this atmosphere of fear and paranoia, Margaret Douglas, who is now 20 years old, meets Lord Thomas Howard. And honestly, he was probably the worst possible person she could have fallen for. Not because he was a bad person, but because of who he was connected to. Thomas Howard was the younger brother of the Duke of Norfolk, and he was the uncle of both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Yes, that means he was part of the Howard family, one of the most powerful and dangerous families in England. Now, here is where it gets complicated. Thomas Howard was not just any nobleman. He was young, probably in his mid-20s. He was educated, charming, and by all accounts quite good-looking. But more importantly, he was part of the same circle as Margaret. They both moved in the royal court. They both served in the same households. They saw each other at dinners, at dances, at religious services. And somewhere in all of that proximity, somewhere in all those stolen glances and brief conversations, they fell in love. But when did it start? Well, we do not know exactly, but most historians think it began sometime in late 1535 or early 1536. They were probably discreet at first. A smile here, a conversation there. Maybe Thomas would recite poetry to her. Maybe Margaret would blush and look away. Maybe they would find excuses to be in the same room, to stand near each other, to brush hands as they passed. And then came more serious. They started writing to each other. Secret notes, probably passed through trusted servants. And at some point, probably in the spring of 1536, they made a promise to each other. They pre-contracted themselves. Now, what does that mean? In Tudor England, a pre-contract was basically a promise to marry. It was not quite a legal marriage, but it was close. If you made a pre-contract and then consummated it, that was considered binding. You were essentially married in the eyes of the church. Did Margaret and Thomas consummate their pre-contract? We do not know for sure, but the fact that they made the promise at all was dangerous enough. Because Margaret Douglas was third in line to the English throne at that point. Henry VIII had just declared both of his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, illegitimate. That meant after Prince Edward, if he ever had a son, the next person in line was Henry Fitzroy, the king's illegitimate son with Bessie Blount. And after Fitzroy, Margaret Douglas. So when she secretly promised to marry Thomas Howard without asking the king's permission, she was essentially committing treason. She was making a decision about the succession of the English throne without consulting the king, and Henry VIII. He did not take kindly to that sort of thing. But here is what I find so beautiful and so heartbreaking about this story. They knew it was dangerous. They knew they were taking a massive risk, and they did it anyway. Because sometimes love makes you brave, sometimes love makes you stupid, and sometimes love makes you willing to gamble everything for a chance at happiness. We know about their relationship because of something called the Devonshire Manuscript. Have you ever heard of it? It is one of the most fascinating documents from the Tudor period. It is basically a poetry anthology that was compiled by several women at Henry VIII's court, including Margaret Douglas herself. And hidden in its pages are poems that Margaret and Thomas exchanged. Let me read you one that is attributed to Margaret. She wrote, "Now may I mourn as one of late driven by great pain. For where I trusted, I am deceived, and all my love is turned to hate, and all for lack of faithfulness. Can you hear the pain in those words, the betrayal, the longing? And Thomas wrote back to her. One of his poems says, "I cannot live thus any longer. Day by day I am weaker and weaker. To see my love in pain and danger, and I may not help make my heart fear." He is saying he cannot bear to see her suffering. He wants to protect her. He loves her so much that her pain is his pain. These are not just flowery words, these are real emotions from real people. When you read their poetry, you can feel the desperation, the passion, the fear. They knew they were playing with fire. They knew the king could crush them at any moment. But they kept writing, they kept loving, they kept hoping that somehow it would all work out. Spoiler alert, it did not work out. In July of 1536, someone talked. We do not know who, maybe a servant who saw them together, maybe a jealous courtier, maybe someone who wanted to curry favour with the king by exposing a scandal, but somehow Henry VIII found out about the pre-contract, and he was absolutely furious. Think about it from his perspective for a moment. He had just gotten rid of Anne Boleyn. He had just declared both of his daughters bastards. His succession was a mess. And now his niece, who had a legitimate claim to the throne, had secretly promised to marry a member of the Howard family without his permission. The same Howard family that had just produced two queens, one of whom he had just executed. This was not just a romantic scandal, this was a political crisis. Henry immediately ordered both Margaret and Thomas to be arrested and thrown into the Tower of London, the same tower where Anne Boleyn had been executed just weeks earlier. Can you imagine the terror Margaret must have felt? She was 20 years old and she was being dragged to the same place where she had watched her former mistress go to her death. Did she think she was going to die? Probably. Did she regret falling in love with Thomas? I doubt it. But here is where Henry did something unusual. Instead of just executing them immediately, which he absolutely could have done, he decided to make an example of them in a different way. He had Parliament pass a new law. The Act of Attainder of 1536 specifically forbade any member of the royal family from marrying without the king's explicit consent. The penalty? Death. And it was retroactive, meaning it applied to Margaret and Thomas even though their pre-contract happened before the law was passed. This was Henry VIII basically saying, I make the rules and I can change them whenever I want and you will obey me or you will die. It was terrifying, it was tyrannical, and it worked. From that point on, everyone in the royal family knew that their love lives were not their own. They belonged to the king. Margaret and Thomas were kept in the Tower throughout the summer of 1536. They were held in separate areas, of course. The king was not going to let them see each other, but even in prison, they found a way to communicate. They kept writing poetry. Can you imagine? Locked in the Tower, facing possible execution, and they're still writing love poems to each other. One of the saddest poems in the Devonshire manuscript is one where Margaret talks about being in prison. She writes about being alone, about missing Thomas, about not knowing if she will ever see him again. And you can feel her trying to be brave, trying to hold on to hope, even as everything is falling apart around her. But while they were in the Tower, Margaret's mother, Margaret Tudor, was writing desperate letters to her brother Henry begging him to spare her daughter's life. In one letter, she basically said, "Look, you knew about this relationship earlier and you did not do anything about it. So why are you punishing her now? And also she is my daughter and she is your niece, and for the love of God, please do not kill her." Henry did not respond right away. He let Margaret and Thomas sit in the Tower for months, not knowing if they would live or die. That is psychological torture, by the way. That is how you break someone's spirit. And then, in October of 1536, something changed. Margaret became ill, really ill. She was weak, feverish, probably terrified, definitely heartbroken, and the conditions in the Tower were not exactly conducive to good health. So Henry, perhaps feeling a tiny bit of compassion, or perhaps just not wanting to deal with the political fallout of his niece dying in prison, ordered her to be moved to Syon Abbey. Syon Abbey was still confinement. She was still a prisoner, but it was better than the Tower. At least she had fresh air, better food, and the care of the nuns. But Thomas stayed in the Tower, and his health started to decline too. Have you ever loved someone so much that being separated from them physically hurt? That is what was happening to both of them. They were lovesick, heartbroken, and slowly fading away in their separate prisons. And the worst part? There was nothing they could do about it. They were completely powerless. In the spring of 1537, Thomas Howard's health took a serious turn for the worse. He was weak, malnourished, probably suffering from some kind of illness brought on by the terrible conditions in the Tower. And on October the 29th, 1537, Lord Thomas Howard died. He was only 26 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. 26. He died in prison for the crime of falling in love. He never got to marry Margaret. He never got to hold her hand again. He never got to see her face or hear her voice. He just wasted away in a cold stone cell, writing poetry to a woman he would never see again. And Margaret? She was released from Syon Abbey just 2 days before he died. 2 days. Can you imagine the cruelty of that timing? She got her freedom back, and within 48 hours the man she loved was dead. Did she get to see him before he died? No. Did she get to say goodbye? No. Did she get to tell him she still loved him, that she would have married him if she could, that none of this was his fault? No. She got nothing, just the news that he was gone, and the knowledge that their love, their beautiful, doomed, tragic love, had cost him everything. You know what breaks my heart the most about this story? It is not just that they were separated. It is not just that Thomas died. It is that Margaret had to live with the guilt and the grief for the rest of her life. She survived and he did not. And in Tudor England, survival always came with a price. After Thomas died, Margaret never spoke publicly about him again. She could not. It was too dangerous. Henry VIII had made his point. Love without permission was treason. Emotions were political weapons. Your heart did not belong to you. But we know she never forgot him. Because years later, when she was an old woman, the Devonshire manuscript was still in her possession. She kept those poems. She kept his words. She kept the evidence of their love hidden away, preserved, protected. And that tells you everything you need to know about how much he meant to her. Here is the question that haunts me about this whole story. Was it worth it? If Margaret could go back and choose differently, would she? Would she avoid Thomas Howard, play it safe, protect herself? Or would she choose him again, knowing exactly how it would end? I think she would choose him again, because sometimes the worst mistake of your life is also the most real, most human, most beautiful thing you ever do. Sometimes the love that destroys you is also the love that proves you are alive. Margaret Douglas learned something crucial in that tower cell, something that would shape the rest of her life. She learned that love was dangerous. She learned that passion could kill you. She learned that in Henry VIII's England your heart was a liability. And she learned that if you wanted to survive, you had to be more careful, more calculating, more cold. But she also learned something else. She learned that she was capable of loving someone enough to risk everything. She learned that she had more courage than she thought, and she learned that she could survive losing the person she loved most and still keep going. Coming up next, we are going to see what happened after Margaret left the tower. We are going to see how this tragedy changed her, hardened her, taught her to play the game differently. Because incredibly, unbelievably, Margaret Douglas made the same mistake again. Just 5 years later, she fell in love with another Howard, and once again, it landed her in serious trouble. Some people never learn, right? Or maybe, just maybe, some people value love more than safety. Let us find out which one Margaret was. You would think that after everything Margaret Douglas went through, after watching the man she loved die in the tower, after barely escaping with her own life, she would have learned to be more careful. You would think she would have built walls around her heart so high that nobody could ever scale them again. You would think she would have played it safe for the rest of her life. But here is the thing about grief, about trauma, about having your heart broken in the most brutal way possible. It does not always make you cautious. Sometimes it makes you reckless. Sometimes it makes you grab onto the next glimpse of happiness with both hands. Consequences be damned, because you have already lost everything once, and you know you can survive it. Or maybe you're just hoping that this time it will be different. So let me tell you about the second time Margaret Douglas fell in love with a Howard. Because yes, she did it again. And if you are sitting there thinking, wait, she fell for another member of the same family that got her thrown in the tower the first time, the answer is yes. Absolutely yes. And honestly, I cannot decide if that makes her incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, maybe both. It is now 1541. 5 years have passed since Thomas Howard died. 5 years since Margaret was released from Sion Abbey, broken and grieving. And in those 5 years, a lot has changed in England. Henry VIII is now on wife number 5. Can you keep track? Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, and now, in 1540, he has married Catherine Howard. And here is where it gets really messy. Catherine Howard was Thomas Howard's niece. Yes, that Thomas Howard, the man Margaret loved. So when Catherine became queen, Margaret found herself serving yet another Howard at court. Talk about awkward. Can you imagine serving the niece of the man you loved? The man who died because of you? Well, not because of you, but you know what I mean. The guilt alone would be crushing. But Margaret did what she always did. She put on a smile, she played her role, and she served Queen Catherine Howard with all the grace and dignity expected of a lady of the court. And that is where she met him. Charles Howard. Another Howard. Are you sensing a pattern here? Charles Howard was Catherine Howard's brother. He was young, probably in his early 20s, and according to the records we have, he was charming, well-educated, and came from one of the most powerful families in England. But more than that, he reminded Margaret of Thomas. How could he not? They were related. They probably looked similar, talked similar, moved in the same circles. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something about Margaret's state of mind at this point. She was 26 years old. In Tudor England, that was practically middle-aged for a woman who was not married. Most noble women were married by 16 or 17. Margaret had already been engaged once and lost her fiancé to death. She had been imprisoned, disgraced, and nearly executed. Her prospects for a good marriage were essentially zero at this point. Nobody wanted to marry the king's niece who had already caused one massive scandal. She was damaged goods in the eyes of Tudor society. Too dangerous, too controversial, too much baggage. So when Charles Howard showed interest in her, when he paid attention to her, when he made her feel wanted again, can you really blame her for being drawn to him? But here is the crucial question. Did she love Charles Howard the way she loved Thomas Howard? Honestly, probably not. This was not the grand passion, the soul-deep connection that she had with Thomas. This was something more desperate, more practical. This was a woman who was lonely, who was aging out of marriageability, who saw maybe her last chance at having a family, at being chosen, at not dying alone and forgotten. And Charles? Well, we do not know much about his motivations. Maybe he genuinely cared for Margaret. Maybe he was ambitious and saw an opportunity to connect himself to the royal family. Maybe he was just young and foolish and did not think about the consequences. Whatever the reason, by the Sipkok and the spring of 1541, they were involved. But they were careful this time, or at least they tried to be. There are no records of a formal pre-contract. There are no love poems in the Devonshire manuscript. This was not the passionate, reckless romance that Margaret had with Thomas. This was quieter, more secretive. They met in private, they exchanged gifts, they talked about marriage, but they did not make it official. Except, of course, someone found out. Someone always finds out at the Tudor court. Maybe a servant saw them together. Maybe a jealous courtier spread rumours. Maybe Charles said something to the wrong person. We do not know exactly how it happened, but by the summer of 1541 word had reached Henry VIII that his niece was involved with another Howard. Now you might think Henry would have exploded with rage just like he did the first time. You might think he would have thrown both of them into the tower immediately. But here is what is fascinating: he did not. He was much softer about it this time. Why? Well, several reasons. First, Henry was getting older. He was 50 years old by this point, and his health was declining. The leg ulcers that would eventually kill him were already causing him constant pain. He was not the vigorous, athletic king he had been in his youth. He was tired, sick, and maybe just a little bit more forgiving. Second, and this is crucial, Margaret had not actually broken the law this time. Remember that Act of Attainder from 1536 that made it treason for a royal family member to marry without permission? Well, Margaret and Charles had not married. They had not even made a formal pre-contract. They had just been, romantically involved, which was scandalous, yes, but not technically illegal. Third, Henry had other things to worry about. By the end of 1541, rumours were swirling about Queen Catherine Howard's infidelity. The king's fifth wife was about to be arrested, interrogated, and eventually executed for adultery. So Henry had bigger problems than his niece's love life. But that does not mean he just ignored it. Oh no. Henry might have been more lenient, but he still needed to make a point. So instead of throwing Margaret in the tower, he had her placed under house arrest. She was sent away from court, confined to the countryside, kept under watch. It was punishment, but it was gentle punishment. A slap on the wrist compared to what she had endured the first time. And Charles Howard, he was questioned, warned, and then essentially told to stay away from Margaret. There was no imprisonment, no execution, no drama. Just a firm warning from the king, do not ever try this again. Now, here is what I find interesting about this second scandal. Margaret's response to it tells us so much about how she had changed. After Thomas Howard died, she was devastated. She was broken. She mourned him for years, but after Charles Howard was taken away from her, there is no record of deep grief, there are no poems about heartbreak, there is just silence, and then she moved on. What does that tell us? I think it tells us that Margaret had learned to compartmentalize her emotions. She had learned that survival was more important than love. She had learned that some losses are bearable because they were never that deep to begin with. She had tried to recreate what she had with Thomas, and she could not. And when it fell apart, she accepted it and moved forward. But here is the really tragic part of this story. While Margaret was dealing with her own romantic drama, Queen Catherine Howard was falling apart. In November of 1541, just months after Margaret's scandal with Charles Howard, the Queen was arrested for adultery. She had allegedly been involved with several men before her marriage to Henry, and possibly during it as well. The interrogations were brutal. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, personally questioned Catherine. She confessed, or was forced to confess. We will never know which. And on February the 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London. She was probably only 19 years old. Margaret witnessed all of this. She had served Catherine. She had known her. And now she watched as another Howard was destroyed by the Tudor machinery of power. Another young woman, another scandal, another execution. The pattern was becoming sickeningly familiar, and here is what must have been going through Margaret's mind. That could have been me. If she had married Thomas Howard without permission, If the king had decided to make an example of her instead of just imprisoning her, she would have been dead at 20 years old. If she had pushed things further with Charles Howard, if she had been less careful, she could have ended up like Catherine, kneeling on the scaffold with her head on the block. But she did not. She survived, again. And I think that is when Margaret Douglas truly understood the game she was playing. It was not about love. It was not about happiness. It was about survival. It was about being smart enough, cautious enough, lucky enough to still be breathing when everyone else around you was dead. You know what is truly heartbreaking? If you read the historical records from this period, Margaret basically disappears from view for a while after this second scandal. There are no letters, no court appearances, no mentions of her doing anything noteworthy. She just fades into the background, quiet and obedient, exactly what Henry VIII wanted from his female relatives. And I think that silence speaks volumes. Margaret had learned her lesson. She had learned that her heart was a liability. She had learned that love was dangerous. She had learned that if she wanted to survive, if she wanted any chance at a future, she needed to stop making emotional decisions and start making strategic ones. But here is the question that haunts me. What does it cost you to become that person? What happens to your soul when you have to kill the romantic, passionate, hopeful parts of yourself just to stay alive? Margaret Douglas started out as a young woman who believed in love, who wrote poetry, who was willing to risk everything for happiness. And the Tudor court broke that out of her, piece by piece, scandal by scandal, death by death. By the time she was 30 years old, Margaret Douglas had been in love twice. She had been imprisoned twice. She had lost 2 men to the cruelty of Tudor politics. And she had learned that the only way to win was to stop playing for love and start playing for power. And you know what is coming next, right? Because Margaret's story does not end here. In fact, it is about to get much more interesting. Because in 1544, Henry VIII decides to arrange a marriage for her. Not a love match, not a romance, a strategic alliance with the Scottish exile named Matthew Stewart, the Earl of Lennox. And here is the twist. This arranged marriage, this political transaction that Margaret probably dreaded, turns out to be the one thing she'd been searching for all along. Real love. Lasting love. The kind of love that survives scandal and imprisonment and tragedy. The kind of love that produces children and builds dynasties and changes the course of history. So buckle up, because we're about to witness something rare in Tudor history. A royal marriage that actually worked. A love story that did not end in death and disaster. And the beginning of Margaret Douglas's transformation from a tragic romantic figure into one of the most powerful and dangerous women in England. Trust me, you will want to hear what happens when Margaret finally gets what she's always wanted, even if it comes in the most unexpected way possible. Here is something most people do not know about arranged marriages in Tudor England. Sometimes, against all odds, they actually worked. Not often, not usually. But sometimes 2 people who were thrown together for political reasons discovered something real. Something lasting, something that looked a lot like love. And that's exactly what happened to Margaret Douglas. After 2 failed romances, after 2 imprisonments, after learning the hard way that following her heart led to disaster, she finally got something she had never experienced before. A marriage that was both politically advantageous and genuinely happy. Which, if you think about it, is kind of miraculous. It is now 1544. Margaret is 29 years old, which in Tudor terms means she is dangerously close to being unmarriageable. Most noblewomen were grandmothers by that age. But Margaret has baggage. She has scandals in her past. She has been to the Tower twice. No respectable English nobleman wants to touch that with a 10-foot pole. So when Henry VIII decides it is time to marry her off, he has to look elsewhere. He has to get creative. Enter Matthew Stewart, the 4th Earl of Lennox. Now, before you start thinking this is just another Tudor political pawn being sacrificed on the altar of diplomacy, let me tell you about Matthew. Because he was not your typical Scottish nobleman. He was educated, cultured, and by all accounts genuinely handsome. Contemporary descriptions say he was tall, well-built, with dark hair and striking features. He spoke French fluently, played musical instruments, and wrote poetry. Sound familiar? He was basically Thomas Howard, but Scottish and with better survival instincts. But here is what made Matthew really interesting. He was a traitor. At least that is what the Scots thought. Matthew had been born into one of the most powerful families in Scotland, with a legitimate claim to the Scottish throne. But in 1544 he was living in exile in England. Why? Because he had betrayed his country. Let me give you some context. Scotland and England were at war. Again. They were always at war. It was basically their default state of existence. Henry VIII wanted to control Scotland, and he had this idea called the rough wooing. Terrible name, by the way. The plan was to force the Scots to agree to marry the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, to Henry's son, Prince Edward. When diplomacy failed, Henry resorted to violence. He sent armies to Scotland to burn, pillage, and terrorise the country into submission. And Matthew Stewart? He sided with the English. He offered his allegiance to Henry VIII and promised to help capture Dumbarton Castle, which was a strategic fortress that Henry desperately wanted. In exchange, Henry promised to restore Matthew's Scottish estates and give him power and wealth. So Matthew became an English agent, working against his own country. The Scots declared him a traitor and confiscated all his lands. Now, you might be thinking, wait, so Henry's marrying his niece to a traitor? Yes, exactly, because Henry saw an opportunity. If he could marry Uckret Douglas, who had Tudor blood and a claim to the English throne, to Matthew Stewart, who had a claim to the Scottish throne, their children would have claims to both kingdoms. It was a dynastic power play. Henry was thinking generations ahead. But here is what I find so fascinating. Nobody asked Margaret what she thought about this. Nobody cared if she wanted to marry a Scottish exile she had never met. Nobody checked to see if they would be compatible. This was a transaction, pure and simple. Henry gave the order, and Margaret was expected to obey. Can you imagine what must have been going through her head? She had already lost 2 men she actually loved. She had already learned that marrying for love was dangerous. And now she was being forced to marry a stranger for political reasons. She probably went into that marriage expecting nothing. No love, no happiness, just duty, just survival. Just another compromise in a life full of compromises. The wedding took place on June the 26th, 1544, at St. James's Palace in London. It was a small ceremony, nothing grand or elaborate. Henry VIII attended, which was significant. He was giving his blessing, showing that this marriage had his approval. Margaret wore probably a beautiful gown, probably smiled politely, probably said her vows with a calm voice while her heart was completely numb. And then something unexpected happened. Margaret and Matthew actually liked each other. I know, right? After everything she had been through, after all the tragedy and heartbreak, she finally met someone who understood her. Someone who treated her with respect. Someone who made her laugh. Someone who, against all odds, became her partner, her friend, and eventually her love. We know this because of the letters they wrote to each other. When they were apart, which happened often because of political and military obligations, they corresponded regularly. And these letters are not the stiff, formal communications you would expect from an arranged marriage. They are warm, affectionate, even playful. Margaret calls Matthew her sweet lord. He calls her his dear heart. They share jokes, they discuss their children, they support each other through difficulties. There is also a piece of jewellery that survived from this period. It is called the Lennox jewel, and it is now part of the royal collection. Have you ever seen it? It is this intricate gold pendant, covered in symbols and inscriptions. There is a heart, a crown, a salamander, a turtle dove. Each symbol represents something about their relationship, their hopes for their children, their dynastic ambitions. The heart represents their love. The crown represents their royal blood. The salamander was a symbol of endurance through Slee, which, given everything they both went through, seems appropriate. And the turtle dove, that was a symbol of faithfulness and devotion. Matthew probably gave this to Margaret as a gift, maybe on their wedding day, maybe on an anniversary. And the fact that it survived, the fact that it was preserved and passed down through generations, tells you how much it meant to them. But the real evidence of their love is simpler and sadder. They had 8 children together. 8. And in Tudor England, where childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women, having 8 children meant Margaret was willing to risk her life again and again to build a family with this man. That is not something you do for a husband you hate. That is something you do for someone you love. Of course, not all of those children survived. Infant mortality was brutal in the 16th century. 6 of their 8 children died in infancy or early childhood. Can you imagine that pain? Bearing child after child, watching them sicken and die, knowing there was nothing you could do to save them. Margaret and Matthew endured that together. They held each other through that grief. And somehow their marriage survived it. Only 2 of their children made it to adulthood. Henry Stuart, who would become Lord Darnley, and Charles Stuart, who would become the 5th Earl of Lennox. We're going to talk a lot more about Darnley later, because boy, does that story get complicated. But for now, just know that Margaret poured all her hopes, all her ambitions, all her dreams into those 2 surviving sons. Here is what I want you to understand about Margaret's marriage to Matthew. It saved her, not just politically, although it did do that. It gave her status, protection, a household of her own, but it saved her emotionally too. After years of loneliness, of being shuffled from place to place, of losing everyone she loved, she finally had someone who was hers, someone who chose to stay, someone who built a life with her. And Matthew, he got something too. He got a wife who understood power, who knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics, who could help him achieve his goals. Because make no mistake, Matthew Stuart was ambitious. He wanted his lands back in Scotland. He wanted power. He wanted his family to rise. And Margaret was the perfect partner for that. She was smart, cunning, and absolutely ruthless when she needed to be. Together, they became the formidable team. They schemed together, planned together, worked together to advance their family's interests. And the Tudor court watched them with a mixture of respect and fear, because everyone knew that Margaret and Matthew were not just a married couple. They were a political alliance, and they were dangerous. But here is what makes this story so beautiful. They were also genuinely happy. You can be ambitious and in love at the same time. You can be politically calculating and emotionally fulfilled. Margaret finally got to experience what most people take for granted, a partnership, someone to come home to, someone to share meals with, someone to whisper secrets to in the dark, someone to hold when the world got too heavy. Do you think she ever thought about Thomas Howard? Probably. Do you think she ever wondered what her life would have been like if he had survived? If they had been allowed to marry? Of course, but I also think she understood something that most romantic people struggle to accept. Sometimes the love of your life is not your first love. Sometimes it is not the passionate, all-consuming, burn everything down kind of love. Sometimes it is the quiet, steady, builds over time kind of love. Sometimes it is the person who shows up every day and chooses you, again and again. And that was Matthew. He showed up. He stayed. He chose Margaret, with all her baggage, all her scandals, all her complications, and she chose him right back. And together they built something that lasted. Now, I wish I could tell you that they lived happily ever after with no more drama, no more scandal, no more But this is Tudor England we are talking about. And Margaret and Matthew were about to become players in one of the biggest political dramas of the 16th century. Because having children with claims to the English and Scottish thrones, that was always going to attract attention. That was always going to make enemies. That was always going to put them in danger. And the biggest danger of all was sitting on the English throne. Queen Elizabeth I, remember her, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman who became queen in 1558? Well, Elizabeth hated Margaret Douglas. Absolutely despised her. Why? Because Margaret was Catholic, because Margaret had a claim to the throne, and because Margaret had something Elizabeth would never have. Sons, legitimate heirs, a dynasty. And when Margaret started plotting to marry her son Darnley to Mary, Queen of Scots, creating a super alliance that could threaten Elizabeth's reign, well, that is when things got really interesting. That is when the gloves came off. That is when Margaret Douglas went from being a survivor to being a player, a schemer, a woman willing to risk everything, including her freedom and her life, to see her grandchildren on the throne. But that is a story for our next chapter. Right now, I want you to sit with this moment of happiness, this brief period in Margaret's life when she had love, stability, family, when she was not running, not hiding, not imprisoned, when she was just a woman with a husband she loved and children she adored. Because that happiness, that peace, it made what came next even more devastating. And it made Margaret's choices even more understandable. When you finally have something worth fighting for, you will fight harder than you ever thought possible, even if it destroys you. There is a particular skill that very few people master in life. The ability to survive not just one dangerous situation, but multiple dangerous situations, over and over again, for decades. To walk through a minefield and make it out alive once is luck. To do it 5 times, that is something else entirely. That is strategy. That is intelligence. That is a level of political awareness that borders on genius. Margaret Douglas served 5 of Henry VIII's 6 wives. Think about that for a moment. 5 queens, 5 very different women with very different personalities, very different fates, and Margaret was there for all of it. She watched them rise, she watched them fall, she watched some of them walk to the scaffold, and through it all she survived. She adapted, she learned. She became arguably one of the most politically astute women in Tudor England. Let me walk you through each one, because the way Margaret navigated each relationship tells you everything you need to know about how she evolved as a person. First, there was Anne Boleyn. We have already talked about this one. Margaret was appointed as a lady-in-waiting to Anne in 1536, right at the end. She was there for the last few months of Anne's reign, when everything was falling apart, when the accusations were flying, when the king was already mentally preparing himself to get rid of her. Can you imagine being in that household? The tension must have been unbearable. Everyone watching their words, everyone terrified of being associated with the Queen when she fell. And fall she did. On May the 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London. Margaret was 20 years old, and that execution taught her something crucial. No matter how powerful you are, no matter how much the king loves you, you are never safe. Today you are queen, tomorrow you are dead. That is how fast things can change. But here is what is interesting. Margaret did not like Anne Boleyn. Remember, she was close friends with Princess Mary, Anne's stepdaughter, the girl whose mother Anne had replaced. So Margaret was serving a woman she probably despised, watching her get exactly what Margaret thought she deserved. And yet, I bet watching that execution still shook her, because it proved that Henry VIII was capable of killing anyone, even the mother of his child, even someone he'd moved heaven and earth to marry. Then came Jane Seymour. Now Margaret did not serve Jane for very long, because Jane died in October of 1537, just 16 months after becoming queen. She died of complications from childbirth, 12 days after giving birth to the future King Edward VI. And this taught Margaret a different lesson. Even if you do everything right, even if you give the king exactly what he wants, which is a son, you can still die. Queens were expendable, women were expendable. Your worth was measured in your ability to produce male heirs, and even that could kill you. Next was Anne of Cleves, and this one is actually kind of funny. Anne of Cleves is often portrayed as the lucky one, the wife who escaped with her life and a generous divorce settlement. Henry married her in January of 1540, took one look at her, decided he was not attracted to her, and spent the next 6 months trying to figure out how to get out of the marriage. By July they were divorced, and Anne was given estates, money, and the title of the king's beloved sister. Margaret was at court during all of this, and I would love to know what she thought about it. Did she pity Anne of Cleves? Did she admire her? Because honestly, Anne of Cleves was probably the smartest of all Henry's wives. She agreed to the divorce. She did not fight it. She did not cling to her position as queen. She accepted the settlement and lived quietly and comfortably for the rest of her life. She outlived Henry. She outlived all his other wives. She got to attend the coronation of Queen Mary I in 1553. That is what I call winning. Then came Catherine Howard. We talked about her a bit in the last section, but let me give you more context because Margaret's relationship with Catherine was complicated and painful. Catherine Howard was young, maybe only 16 or 17 when she became queen in 1540. She was pretty, vivacious, and completely unprepared for the role, and she was Thomas Howard's niece. Yes, that Thomas Howard, the man Margaret had loved and lost. So Margaret found herself serving the niece of her dead fiancé. Can you imagine how awkward that must have been? Every time she looked at Catherine, did she see Thomas? Did she remember writing poetry in secret, exchanging promises, believing that love could conquer all? Did Catherine even know about Margaret's history with her uncle? Probably not. Catherine was too young, too self-absorbed, too busy with her own problems. And boy, did Catherine have problems. By November of 1541, rumours were spreading that she had been sexually active before her marriage to the king, and possibly during it as well. The investigations began, the interrogations, the confessions, and Margaret watched it all unfold, probably with a sick feeling in her stomach, because she had seen this before with Anne Boleyn. She knew how it would end. On February the 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower. She was probably only 19 years old. And Margaret, she had now witnessed 2 queens go to the scaffold. 2 women, roughly her own age, executed for crimes related to love and sex. If that does not reinforce the lesson that your heart can get you killed, I do not know what does. Finally, there was Catherine Parr. She became Henry VIII's 6th and final wife in July of 1543, and she was different from all the others. She was older, wiser, more educated. She'd been married twice before, both times to older men who died and left her a wealthy widow. She was 31 years old, which in Tudor terms was practically ancient for a bride, but she was also smart enough to know how to manage Henry. And Margaret. She served Catherine Parr with what seems to be genuine affection. There are records of them exchanging gifts, of Catherine giving Margaret money and favours. Catherine was kind to Margaret, and more importantly, she survived. She outlived Henry VIII, who died in January of 1547. Catherine Parr was the only one of his wives to actually be widowed rather than divorced or executed. That is a victory in itself. But here is what I find most fascinating about Margaret's time serving these 5 queens. She learned different lessons from each one. From Anne Boleyn, she learned that power is fleeting. From Jane Seymour, she learned that even success can be deadly. From Anne of Cleves, she learned that sometimes the smartest move is to walk away. From Catherine Howard, she learned that the past always catches up with you. And from Catherine Parr, she learnt that survival requires intelligence, adaptability, and knowing when to keep your mouth shut. Now, you might be wondering, what about Queen Mary I? Did not Margaret serve her too? Yes, absolutely. Mary became queen in 1553 after the brief and tragic reign of Lady Jane Grey, who was queen for only 9 days before being deposed and eventually executed. And Margaret's relationship with Mary was special, different from all the others. Remember, Margaret and Mary had been childhood friends. They'd grown up together, supported each other through the darkest times. When Mary finally became queen at the age of 37, after years of being declared illegitimate, after years of living in fear and uncertainty, one of the first things she did was honour Margaret Douglas. She made her First Lady of the Bedchamber, which was the most prestigious position a woman could hold at court. What does a First Lady of the Bedchamber do? Well, she controls access to the Queen. She manages the Queen's private apartments. She knows all the Queen's secrets. She helps the Queen dress, advises her, comforts her. It is a position of immense trust and power. And Mary gave it to Margaret because she knew Margaret would be loyal. They'd been through too much together for Margaret to betray her now. But Margaret also had another role under Queen Mary. She was keeper of the privy purse. That means she controlled the Queen's personal finances. She managed the money that Mary spent on clothes, gifts, household expenses. This gave Margaret access to enormous sums of money and enormous influence. If you wanted a favour from the Queen, you might go through Margaret first. If you needed money, you asked Margaret. She became in effect one of the most powerful women in England. And here is what is so impressive. Margaret held on to that power for the entire 5 years of Mary's reign. She did not make enemies. She did not overstep. She did not get too ambitious. She just quietly did her job, supported her friend, and accumulated wealth and influence. That is mastery. That is someone who has learned from every mistake, every scandal, every near-death experience. But there is something bittersweet about this too. Margaret was finally safe. She was finally secure. She had a position, an income, respect, power. And yet she was still childless in a meaningful way. Yes, she had 2 surviving sons with Matthew Stewart, but they were growing up, becoming their own people with their own ambitions. And Margaret was getting older. She was in her 40s by the time Mary became queen. The years were passing, and she knew that her window to shape the future, to create a legacy, was closing. So what does a woman do when she has power, when she has influence, when she has survived everything the Tudor court could throw at her? But she does not have immortality. She plans, she schemes, she looks at her sons and she thinks, if I cannot be queen, maybe my son can be king. If I cannot control my own destiny, maybe I can control the destiny of the next generation. And that's exactly what Margaret Douglas started to do. She started looking north, toward Scotland, toward her half-brother's daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. She started thinking about marriages, about alliances, about how to link the Tudor and Stuart bloodlines in a way that would put her grandson on the English throne. She started playing the long game, the dangerous game, the game that would eventually land her in the Tower of London for the 3rd time. You know what is truly remarkable about Margaret Douglas? She was not born powerful. She was not born with advantages. She was born in a freezing castle to a mother who abandoned her and a father who ignored her. She was shuffled around, imprisoned, heartbroken, widowed of her first love before they could even marry. She had every reason to give up, to fade into obscurity, to just survive quietly and gratefully. But she did not do that. She turned every setback into a lesson. She turned every tragedy into ammunition. She became someone who understood power better than almost anyone else at court because she had lived without it and fought for it and lost it and regained it so many times. She knew exactly how fragile it was. She knew exactly how to hold on to it. And now, with Queen Mary on the throne and Margaret in a position of influence, she was ready to make her move. She was ready to stop being a survivor and start being a player. She was ready to gamble everything one more time for the highest stakes imaginable, the throne of England itself. Coming up, we are going to see Margaret at her most ambitious, her most calculating, her most dangerous. We are going to see her orchestrate one of the most controversial marriages of the 16th century, the marriage between her son Lord Darnley and Mary, Queen of Scots. We are going to see her go head-to-head with Queen Elizabeth I, the most powerful woman in Europe. And we are going to see her pay the price for her ambition in the most painful way possible. Because when you play the Game of Thrones in Tudor England, you either win or you lose everything. And Margaret was about to find out which one it would be. Every parent wants their children to do better than they did, to have more opportunities, more success, more happiness. But when you are Margaret Douglas, and your children carry the bloodlines of both the Tudor and Stuart dynasties, doing better means something very different. It means thrones. It means crowns. It means power on a scale that most people can only dream about. And it means you are willing to risk everything, including your freedom and your life, to make that happen. By 1558, the game had changed completely. Queen Mary I had died in November of that year, childless and heartbroken. And who took the throne? Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the Protestant princess, the woman who'd been declared illegitimate and then unillegitimate depending on which way the political winds were blowing. And Elizabeth absolutely despised Margaret Douglas. Why? Well, think about it from Elizabeth's perspective. She is now queen, but she has no husband, no children, no clear heir. And who is next in line for the throne, at least in the eyes of many Catholics? Mary, Queen of Scots. And who is after Mary? Margaret Douglas and her sons. Elizabeth looks at Margaret and sees a threat, a Catholic threat. A woman with royal blood who could potentially rally opposition against her. A woman who is married to a Scottish nobleman and has sons who could unite England and Scotland under Catholic rule. So Elizabeth is watching Margaret, constantly, suspiciously, waiting for her to make a wrong move. And Margaret, she knows she is being watched. She knows she is in danger, but she also knows that she has an opportunity. Because Mary, Queen of Scots, is a widow. Let me give you some context here. Mary, Queen of Scots, had been married to Francis II of France. She became Queen of France at the age of 16 when Francis inherited the throne in 1559. But Francis was sickly weak, and he died in December of 1560 after only 17 months as king. Mary was widowed at 18 years old, and suddenly she had to decide what to do with her life. Should she stay in France, or should she return to Scotland and rule her own kingdom? She chose Scotland. In August of 1561, Mary, Queen of Scots, returned to her homeland to take up personal rule. And the moment she set foot in Edinburgh, every ambitious mother in Europe started thinking the same thing. Who is she going to marry next? Margaret Douglas definitely thought about it. In fact, she had been thinking about it for years, because Mary, Queen of Scots, was Margaret's half-niece. Let me explain that complicated family tree for a moment. Margaret's mother was Margaret Tudor. Margaret Tudor's son from her first marriage was King James V of Scotland. James V's daughter was Mary, Queen of Scots. So Mary and Margaret Douglas were related through Margaret Tudor. They were family. Distant family, but still family. And Margaret had a son, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was tall, handsome, well-educated, played the lute, wrote poetry, and most importantly, he had royal blood. Through his mother, he was descended from Henry VII. Through his father, he was descended from Scottish royalty. On paper, he was the perfect match for Mary, Queen of Scots. If they married, their children would have an incredibly strong claim to both the English and Scottish thrones. They would be essentially unstoppable. Margaret saw all of this. She saw the opportunity, she saw the potential, and she started plotting. Now, the word plotting has such negative connotations, right? It makes her sound like a villain in a story. But from Margaret's perspective, she was just being a good mother. She was trying to secure her son's future. She was trying to create opportunities for her grandchildren. The fact that it would also dramatically increase her own power and influence, well, that was just a happy side effect. But here is the problem. Queen Elizabeth I absolutely did not want this marriage to happen. She wanted Mary to marry someone safe, someone controllable, someone who would not threaten English interests. Elizabeth even suggested that Mary should marry Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who was Elizabeth's own favourite and possibly her lover. Can you imagine the audacity of that suggestion? "Hey Mary, you should marry the man I am sleeping with because then I can control both of you." Obviously, Mary was not interested in that arrangement, so Margaret started working behind the scenes. She began corresponding with Mary, Queen of Scots. She sent letters praising her, offering advice, building a relationship. She sent her son Darnley to Scotland in February of 1565, officially to offer condolences for the death of Mary's father-in-law, but really to introduce him to Mary and let them meet. And it worked. Mary took one look at Darnley and was smitten, absolutely head over heels. Why? Well, Darnley was tall, really tall, over 6 feet, which was unusually tall for the 16th century. Mary herself was very tall for a woman, about 5 feet 11 inches, and she loved that Darnley was taller than her. He was also charming, cultured, and he knew how to flatter her. He played music for her, danced with her, wrote her poetry. He was attentive and romantic and said all the right things. Mary fell in love fast. By April of 1565, she was determined to marry him. And Elizabeth? Elizabeth was furious. She sent letters demanding that Mary reconsider. She sent diplomats to argue against the marriage. She tried everything she could to stop it. But Mary was stubborn, and she was in love, and she was not going to let Elizabeth tell her what to do. On July the 29th, 1565, Mary, Queen of Scots, married Lord Darnley at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. It was a Catholic ceremony, which further enraged the Protestant nobles in Scotland and horrified Elizabeth. And the moment the marriage was official, Elizabeth made her move. She arrested Margaret Douglas and threw her in the Tower of London. Yes, the Tower again. For the third time in her life, Margaret found herself imprisoned in that cold stone fortress. But this time was different. This time she was not a lovesick girl who had made a foolish romantic mistake. She was a 50-year-old woman who had deliberately, strategically orchestrated a royal marriage that threatened the stability of England. This was not about love. This was about politics. This was about power. And Elizabeth knew it. There is actually graffiti that still exists in the tower from Margaret's imprisonment. One of her servants carved an inscription that reads, "Lady Margaret Douglas, committed prisoner to this lodging for the marriage of her son." It is still there 500 years later, a permanent reminder of her ambition and her punishment. But here is what is fascinating. Elizabeth did not execute Margaret. She could have. She had every legal right to. Margaret had committed treason by arranging a marriage that could threaten the succession without royal permission. But Elizabeth kept her alive. Why? Probably because killing Margaret would have made her a martyr, especially to Catholics. Probably because Margaret was still royal blood and executing royalty sets a dangerous precedent. And probably because Elizabeth hoped that keeping Margaret in the Tower would send a message to Mary, Queen of Scots. I can hurt your family if you cross me. Meanwhile, in Scotland, the marriage that Margaret had worked so hard to create was falling apart spectacularly. Darnley, it turned out, was a terrible husband. All that charm, all that romance, all those pretty words. They disappeared almost immediately after the wedding. Darnley became arrogant, demanding, jealous, and violent. He wanted the crown matrimonial, which would have made him co-ruler of Scotland and allowed him to inherit the throne if Mary died. Mary refused to give it to him, and he became increasingly angry and resentful. Then things got even worse. Darnley became convinced that Mary was having an affair with her Italian secretary, David Riccio. Whether this was true or not, we will never know, but Darnley believed it, or at least claimed to believe it. And in March of 1566 he participated in a conspiracy to murder Riccio. And they did not just murder him quietly, they dragged him out of Mary's private chambers while she watched, pregnant and terrified, and they stabbed him to death right in front of her. 56 stab wounds. Can you imagine Margaret hearing about this while she was locked in the tower? Her son, the boy she had raised, the young man she had pinned all her hopes on, had just committed murder in the most brutal and public way possible. This was not the future she had envisioned. This was a nightmare. But wait, it gets worse. On June the 19th, 1566, Mary gave birth to a son, James. This should have been a moment of celebration. The future King James VI of Scotland, who would eventually become King James I of England, uniting the two crowns just as Margaret had always dreamed. But by this point, Mary's marriage to Darnley was completely destroyed. She hated him, he hated her. They barely spoke to each other. And then, in February of 1567, Darnley was murdered. Someone blew up the house he was staying in at Kirkerfield in Edinburgh, and when they found his body in the garden, he had been strangled. It was clearly an assassination, but who did it? The primary suspect was James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, who was close to Mary. Did Mary know about the plot? Did she approve it? Historians have been arguing about this for 450 years. What we do know is this. On February the 19th, 1567, while Margaret was still imprisoned in the Tower, two women came to give her devastating news. William Cecil's wife, Lady Mildred Cecil, and Lady William Howard, arrived to tell Margaret that her son was dead. Her beloved Darnley, the boy she had raised, the young man she had spent years manoeuvring to marry to a queen, was gone. Murdered at the age of 21. The Spanish ambassador wrote that Margaret's grief was overwhelming, that she became physically ill from the shock, and to make matters worse, they initially told her that her husband, the Earl of Lennox, had also been murdered, which was false but added to her agony. Can you imagine receiving that news while you're locked in a prison cell? Can you imagine the helplessness, the rage, the guilt? Because Margaret must have felt guilty. She had orchestrated this marriage. She had pushed Darnley into this position. She had encouraged his ambitions. And now he was dead, or murdered in a foreign country, and she was locked in the Tower, unable to even mourn him properly or seek justice for his death. You know what is truly heartbreaking about this whole situation? Margaret got everything she wanted and it destroyed her. She wanted her son to marry a queen. She got that. She wanted him to have power and status. She got that too. She wanted her grandchildren to have claims to thrones. She got that as well, because baby James was now heir to Scotland and potentially to England too. But the cost was unbearable. Her son was dead. Her husband was in Scotland trying desperately to find Darnley's killers and bring them to justice. Her reputation was in tatters. Her freedom was gone. And all those dreams, all those plans, all those years of scheming had led to this. A prison cell, a dead son, and a future that was completely out of her control. Coming up next, we are going to see what happens when Margaret is finally released from the Tower. We are going to see her transformation from a grieving mother into something harder, something colder, something more dangerous. We are going to see her quest for justice, her complicated relationship with Mary, Queen of Scots, and the ultimate tragedy that will take her husband from her too. Because Margaret's story is not over yet, the worst is still to come, but so is something unexpected, redemption, vindication, and the long-delayed triumph of seeing her grandson become king. Stay with me because this is where everything comes together. Grief does strange things to people. Sometimes it breaks you completely, leaves you hollow and unable to function. Sometimes it hardens you, turns you into something cold and relentless. And sometimes it transforms you into a force of nature, someone who will stop at nothing to get what they want, whether that is revenge, justice, or simply acknowledgement that the person you lost mattered. Margaret Douglas's grief over Darnley's death did all three. It broke her, hardened her, and transformed her. And what came next would define the final decade of her life. Because Margaret was not the type of woman to accept tragedy quietly. She was not going to fade into the background broken and defeated. No, she was going to fight. She was going to demand justice. And she was going to make sure that everyone involved in her son's death paid the price. But first, she had to get out of the tower. And surprisingly, Elizabeth I released her relatively quickly. By the end of February 1567, just weeks after Darnley's murder, Margaret was freed from the tower and allowed to return to her estates. Why did Elizabeth let her go? Well, several reasons. First, keeping Margaret imprisoned while her son's body was barely cold was bad optics, even for Elizabeth. Second, Margaret was not an immediate threat anymore. Her son was dead, her political schemes had collapsed, and she was a grieving mother, not a scheming politician. At least that is what Elizabeth thought. Elizabeth was wrong. Margaret was absolutely still scheming. But now her schemes were focused on one thing: finding out who killed Darnley and making them pay. And the primary suspect? James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell. He was the captain of Mary, Queen of Scots' guard. He was powerful, ambitious, and ruthless. And he had motive. With Darnley out of the way, Bothwell could potentially marry Mary himself and become King Consort of Scotland. Margaret's husband, the Earl of Lennox, was already in Scotland, desperately trying to bring Bothwell to justice. He demanded that Bothwell be tried for murder. He gathered evidence, questioned witnesses, built a case. But here is where it gets really suspicious. When Bothwell's trial finally happened in April of 1567, it was a complete whitewash. The jury acquitted him, not because the evidence was weak, but because Bothwell had arrived in Edinburgh with a private army of 4,000 men. 4,000 armed soldiers surrounding the courthouse, making it very clear what the verdict should be. Can you imagine how Margaret felt when she heard that news? The man who almost certainly murdered her son had just walked free, and not only that, but Mary, Queen of Scots, had allowed it to happen. In fact, it was worse than that. On May the 15th, 1567, just 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell. Yes, you heard that right. She married the man accused of murdering her husband, the father of her child. Now, here is where the story gets really complicated, and historians are still arguing about it today. Did Mary love Bothwell? Was she forced into the marriage? Did she know about Darnley's murder beforehand? The truth is, we will probably never know for certain. What we do know is that Mary's decision to marry Bothwell was political suicide. The Scottish nobles were outraged, the common people were scandalised, even Mary's supporters were horrified. Within weeks, the Scottish lords rose up in rebellion. They called themselves the Confederate Lords, and they marched against Mary and Bothwell with the stated goal of rescuing baby Prince James from his allegedly murderous mother and her new husband. On June the 15th, 1567, the two armies faced each other at Carbery Hill. But there was no battle. Mary's forces melted away. Bothwell fled to Denmark, where he would eventually die insane in a prison cell. And Mary was captured by the Confederate lords. They imprisoned her at Loch Leven Castle, a fortress on an island in the middle of a lake. And on July the 24th, 1567, they forced her to abdicate the throne in favour of her 1-year-old son James, her own child, who she would never see again. Mary, Queen of Scots, at the age of 24, lost her throne, her freedom, and her child, all within the space of a few months. And who became regent for the baby King James VI, the Earl of Moray, Mary's illegitimate half-brother? But Moray did not last long. Scotland was a mess of competing factions, violence, and political chaos, and Margaret's husband, the Earl of Lennox, was right in the middle of it. Because Lennox wanted justice for his son. He wanted Bothwell punished. He wanted Mary punished. He wanted everyone involved in Darnley's murder to pay. In 1569, after Moray was assassinated, Lennox himself became regent of Scotland. Yes, Margaret's husband, the exiled traitor who had spent most of his life in England, was now effectively ruling Scotland on behalf of his grandson. It was a stunning reversal of fortune. But it was also incredibly dangerous. Scotland was still in the middle of a civil war. There were nobles who supported Mary, nobles who supported baby James, and nobles who just wanted to grab power for themselves. Lennox was a target. Meanwhile, back in England, Margaret was dealing with her own complicated feelings about Mary, Queen of Scots. On one hand, Mary had allowed Bothwell to go free. Mary had married him. Mary had, at the very least, been complicit in a massive miscarriage of justice. Margaret had every reason to hate her. But on the other hand, Mary was family. Mary was now a prisoner herself, having fled to England in 1568 seeking Elizabeth's protection, only to be placed under house arrest for the next 19 years. And Mary was the mother of Margaret's grandson, the future king. So Margaret did something unexpected. She started corresponding with Mary. She visited her when she was allowed. She even eventually reconciled with her. Not fully, not warmly, but enough to maintain a relationship. Why? Because Margaret was always playing the long game. She knew that baby James was the future. She knew that maintaining some kind of relationship with his mother might be politically useful. And she knew that nursing grudges forever was a luxury she could not afford. But the question of justice for Darnley's murder never went away. Margaret kept pushing for it. She wrote letters to William Cecil, Elizabeth's chief advisor, demanding that the conspirators be punished. She corresponded with her husband in Scotland, strategizing about how to bring the guilty to justice. She became essentially a one-woman crusade for her dead son's honour. And then tragedy struck again. On September the 4th, 1571, the Earl of Lennox was shot and killed during a raid on Stirling by Mary's supporters. He died defending his grandson's throne, fighting for justice for his murdered son. He was 55 years old, and Margaret, she was widowed. Again, for the second time in her life, she lost the man she loved to violence and politics. Can you imagine receiving that news? Your son murdered 4 years ago. Your husband murdered trying to avenge him. Both of them gone. Both of them victims of the same endless cycle of Scottish violence and political intrigue. How does a person survive that? How do you keep going when everything you loved has been taken from you? Margaret did what she always did. She survived. She endured. She kept fighting. Because she still had her grandson James. And she still had hope that someday, somehow, he would inherit not just Scotland, but England too. That her bloodline would finally achieve what she had spent her entire life working toward. The unification of the two kingdoms under a Stuart king with Tudor blood. But grief changes you. Losing two of the most important people in your life within 4 years breaks something inside you that never quite heals. Margaret became harder after Lennox's death, less forgiving, more ruthless. She had already been a political player, but now she became something more dangerous. She became a woman with nothing left to lose, and in 1574 she made one more move that would land her in trouble. One more gamble that would send her to the Tower for the 4th and final time. Because old habits die hard, and Margaret Douglas had never been very good at playing it safe. Her younger son, Charles Stuart, secretly married Elizabeth Cavendish, the daughter of Bess of Hardwicke, one of the most powerful women in England, And guess what? They did it without Queen Elizabeth's permission. Yes, you read that correctly. After everything Margaret had been through, after 3 imprisonments, after losing her son and her husband to political violence, after learning the hard way that unauthorized royal marriages lead to disaster, she was involved in yet another secret wedding. Was she directly responsible? The historical record is unclear, but Elizabeth believed she was, or at least that she had encouraged it, and that was enough. So in November of 1574, at the age of 59, Margaret was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London for the 4th time. 4th time? At this point, the guards at the tower probably knew her by name. They probably had her usual cell ready. "Oh, Lady Margaret is back. Put her in the Beauchamp Tower again. She likes that one." But this imprisonment was different from the others. Margaret was older now. She was tired. She was in poor health. And Elizabeth was making a point. The message was clear. I do not care how old you are, how many times you've been imprisoned before, or how tragic your life has been. You do not marry your children off without my permission. You do not threaten the succession. You do not scheme against me. Margaret was held in the Tower for several months, and while she was there, her daughter-in-law Elizabeth Cavendish gave birth to a daughter. They named her Arabella Stuart. Little Arabella, who would grow up to have her own tragic story of forbidden love and imprisonment, because apparently the pattern of Stuart women being locked in the Tower for marrying without permission was going to continue for at least one more generation. Eventually Elizabeth released Margaret. Again, because what else was she going to do? Execute a 60-year-old widow for her son's marriage? It would have made Elizabeth look petty and cruel, so Margaret was freed, sent back to her estates, warned to behave herself, and this time finally, Margaret got the message. She spent her last few years quietly, focusing on her health, her finances, and her relationship with her grandson James in Scotland. You know what strikes me most about Margaret's quest for justice? She never got it. Not really. Bothwell was never properly punished. Mary, Queen of Scots, never faced real consequences for her role in Darnley's death. At least not from Margaret. The conspirators got away with it. Margaret spent years demanding justice, fighting for it, refusing to let it go, and in the end, she got nothing but more grief and more imprisonment. But maybe that is not the point. Maybe the point was that she tried. Maybe the point was that she loved her son enough to keep fighting for him even when it was hopeless. Maybe the point was that she refused to accept that powerful people can murder the weak and get away with it. Even if she failed, even if justice eluded her, she stood up and said, "This was wrong. My son mattered. His death mattered. And I will not be silent." That takes a different kind of courage than surviving. That takes the courage to keep fighting when you know you might lose. And Margaret had that courage in abundance. Coming up, we are going to see Margaret in her final years, and we are going to witness the one thing she never thought she would see, vindication, because 25 years after her death, her grandson James would become King of England, uniting the crowns just as she had always dreamed. But she would not live to see it. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest irony of all. When you reach your 60s in the 16th century, you're supposed to be done with drama. You're supposed to be the wise elder, the grandmother who sits by the fire and tells stories, the matriarch who has earned peace and quiet after a lifetime of struggle. You're not supposed to be getting dragged to the Tower of London, again, for the 4th time, because your son got married without the Queen's permission, again. But Margaret Douglas was never very good at doing what she was supposed to do, and apparently neither were her children, because in 1574 history repeated itself in the most frustrating, most predictable, most absolutely maddening way possible, and Margaret found herself right back where she had been so many times before, locked in the Tower, wondering how her life had come to this. Let me set the scene for you, because the details of this 4th scandal are both fascinating and a little bit ridiculous. After the death of her husband Lennox in 1571, Margaret had thrown herself into raising her surviving son Charles Stuart. Remember, Henry, Lord Darnley, was dead. That left Charles as her only living child, her last hope for the family legacy, the one who carried all her dreams and ambitions now. Charles was not like his brother. Darnley had been tall, handsome, charming, and ultimately disastrous. Charles was quieter, more scholarly, less flashy. He was not going to be King of Scotland. He was not going to marry a queen. He was just a nobleman with a decent title and a complicated family history. And that should have been fine. That should have been safe. That should have kept him out of trouble. But then he met Elizabeth Cavendish. And she was not just any Elizabeth. She was the daughter of Bess of Hardwicke, one of the richest, most powerful, most politically connected women in England. Bess was a legend in her own right. She had been married 4 times, and each husband had been wealthier than the last. She had built enormous estates, accumulated vast wealth, and positioned herself as a major player in English politics. She was also the custodian of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was still under house arrest at various properties owned by Bess and her 4th husband, the Earl of Shrewsbury. So when Bess's daughter Elizabeth and Margaret's son Charles met, probably at one of the houses where Mary was being held, it was not just a romance between 2 young people. It was a potential alliance between 2 of the most ambitious, most powerful families in England. And that made it dangerous, because any marriage involving people with Tudor and Stuart blood required Queen Elizabeth's permission. That was the law. That was non-negotiable. Margaret knew that better than anyone. But here is where it gets complicated, and this is why historians still argue about what actually happened. Did Margaret encourage the marriage? Did she actively plot it with Bess of Hardwicke? Or did the 2 young people fall in love on their own, and their mothers were caught off guard? The evidence is mixed. Some sources suggest that Margaret and Bess planned the whole thing together, meeting secretly and arranging the match because they both wanted to strengthen their family's claims to the succession. Other sources suggest that Charles and Elizabeth genuinely fell in love and married in secret, and their mothers only found out after the fact. The truth? We will probably never know, but what we do know is that Elizabeth I believed Margaret was involved. And in Tudor England, what the Queen believed mattered more than what actually happened. The wedding took place sometime in the autumn of 1574. It was quiet, private, done without fanfare or royal permission. And for a brief moment, Charles and Elizabeth probably thought they had gotten away with it. Maybe they thought that because they were not as high profile as Darnley and Mary, Queen of Scots, the Queen would not care as much. Maybe they thought that because they had not made a big public announcement, they could keep it secret until the political climate was better. Maybe they were just young and in love and not thinking clearly. They were wrong. Elizabeth found out, and she was furious, not just angry but personally offended, because this felt like a deliberate provocation. Margaret Douglas, who had been imprisoned 3 times already for unauthorized marriages, who had caused endless political headaches, who should have learned her lesson by now, was apparently still scheming, still plotting, still trying to manipulate the succession through strategic marriages. On November the 7th, 1574, Margaret was arrested. Officers came to her residence, informed her that she was being charged with arranging a marriage without royal consent, and escorted her to the Tower of London. She was 59 years old. She had buried a son and a husband in the past 7 years. She was in declining health, and she was being hauled off to prison like a common criminal. Can you imagine what that walk to the Tower must have been like? She had done it 3 times before. She knew every stone, every corridor, every cell. She probably recognized some of the guards. Did they feel sorry for her? Did they wonder why this old woman kept ending up in the same place? Or were they just doing their job, immune to the tragedy of it all? This time, Margaret was placed in less harsh conditions than her previous imprisonments. She was not in a cell with a single window and stone walls. She was given a more comfortable room, allowed to have servants with her, permitted to receive visitors. This was house arrest within the tower, not true imprisonment. Elizabeth was making a point, but she was not trying to kill Margaret, not yet anyway. But comfortable or not, it was still the tower. It was still confinement, it was still being at the Queen's mercy, waiting to find out if you would be released or if you would die there. And Margaret had to sit in that uncertainty for months, knowing that at her age, she might not survive long enough to see freedom again. Meanwhile, her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth Cavendish, was pregnant. She gave birth on November the 27th, 1574, to a baby girl. They named her Arabella Stuart. And this Abby, this tiny infant born while her grandmother was locked in the tower, would grow up to have one of the saddest stories in Tudor history. Because Arabella would inherit her grandmother's bloodline, her grandmother's claim to the throne, and her grandmother's tendency to fall in love with the wrong men at the wrong time. She would eventually be imprisoned in the tower herself, for the same reason Margaret had been imprisoned 4 times, marrying without royal permission. The pattern was going to repeat itself yet again. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, Margaret is in the tower, and she is doing what she has always done, writing letters. She wrote to William Cecil, now Lord Burghley, pleading her innocence. She wrote that she had not arranged the marriage, that she had been as surprised as anyone, that she should not be punished for her son's choices. Did she really believe that? Probably not, but it was worth a try. She also wrote about her health. She was genuinely sick at this point. The stress, the grief, the years of turmoil, they were all catching up with her. She had trouble sleeping, she had difficulty eating, she was losing weight. The tower physicians examined her and reported that she was in serious decline. And this, ironically, is probably what saved her life, because Elizabeth did not want Margaret to die in the tower. That would make her a martyr. That would give her story a tragic ending that people would remember and romanticize. So in February of 1575, after about 3 months in the tower, Margaret was released. Not pardoned, not declared innocent, just released. She was sent to her estates with strict orders to stay out of politics, stop scheming, and behave herself for whatever time she had left. And this time Margaret actually listened. She was done, she was tired, she was old, and she had finally learned that fighting Elizabeth was a losing game. The last few years of Margaret's life were quiet. She focused on managing her estates, which were substantial. Remember, she had been keeper of the privy purse for Queen Mary I, and she had accumulated significant wealth over the years. She had property, investments, income from various sources. She was, by this point, one of the wealthier women in England. Not as rich as Bess of Hardwicke, but comfortable. More than comfortable. She also focused on her relationship with her grandson, King James VI of Scotland. They corresponded regularly. Margaret sent him advice, gifts, money. She positioned herself as the wise grandmother, the link between his English and Scottish heritage. And James, who barely remembered his murdered father and had never known his imprisoned mother, valued that connection. He called her his dearest grandmother. He respected her, he listened to her, and Margaret finally had someone in her family who was actually successful, actually thriving, actually going to achieve great things. But there was one relationship that dominated Margaret's final years, and it was a strange one. Her reconciliation with Mary, Queen of Scots. Remember, Mary was still imprisoned in England, still under house arrest, still hoping that somehow, someday she would be freed or restored to her throne. And Margaret, who had every reason to hate Mary, who blamed her, at least partially, for Darnley's death, chose instead to forgive her. Why? Well, several reasons. First, they were family. Mary was the mother of Margaret's beloved grandson. Second, Mary was suffering too. She had lost her throne, her freedom, her son. She was living in a kind of limbo, neither free nor formally condemned. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Margaret understood that holding on to anger was exhausting. She had spent years demanding justice, fighting for it, refusing to let go, and it had brought her nothing but more pain. Maybe it was time to choose peace instead. So Margaret and Mary wrote to each other. They sent gifts. When they were allowed to meet, they talked about James, about Scotland, about the past. They found common ground in their shared grief, their shared losses, their shared understanding of what it meant to be a woman with royal blood in a world controlled by men who feared them. It was not a close friendship. It was not warm or affectionate, but it was real, and it showed a side of Margaret that we have not seen much of in this story. Her capacity for forgiveness, for letting go, for choosing connection over vengeance. After everything she had been through, after all the betrayals and tragedies, she could have died bitter and angry. Instead, she chose to die at peace, at least with some people, but not with everyone. Margaret never forgave Bothwell, who had escaped justice and died in a Danish prison in 1578, insane and alone. She never forgave the Scottish lords who had murdered her husband. She never forgave the system that had imprisoned her 4 times, destroyed her son's marriage, and stolen so much of her life. Some wounds do not heal, some injustices cannot be forgiven, and Margaret carried those scars with her to her grave. Coming up, we are going to talk about Margaret's final days, her death, and the legacy she left behind. We are going to see how history treated her in the years and centuries after she died, and why she was slowly erased from the story even though she played such a crucial role in it. We are going to talk about what it means to be forgotten, and whether being remembered is really as important as we think it is. Because Margaret's story ends soon, but the questions it raises, those will stay with us long after she is gone. There is something profound about dying before you see your life's work come to fruition. You spend decades building, planning, sacrificing, fighting for a vision of the future that exists only in your imagination. And then, right before that vision becomes reality, you're gone. You never get to say, "I was right. It worked. Everything I suffered for actually mattered." You just have to trust that history will vindicate you, and hope that someone, somewhere, will remember why you fought so hard. Margaret Douglas died on March the 9th, 1578. She was 62 years old, which was actually quite old for the 16th century. She died at her home in Hackney, surrounded by servants and probably a few friends, but notably not surrounded by family. Her son Charles had died the previous year, in 1577, from what was likely tuberculosis. Her grandson James was in Scotland, ruling as king but still just a boy. Her granddaughter Arabella was only 3 years old. Her husband had been dead for 7 years. Her other son had been dead for 11. So Margaret died essentially alone, at least in terms of immediate family. And I wonder if in those final moments she looked back on her life and thought it had been worth it. Did she feel satisfied? Proud? Or did she feel like she'd wasted her time chasing dreams that would never come true? We know she made a will. It was very detailed, very specific about who got what. She left money to servants, to friends, to various charities. She left her best jewels to her granddaughter Arabella. She left instructions for her funeral requesting to be buried at Westminster Abbey, which was a privilege reserved for royalty and the most important nobles. And her request was granted. She was buried in the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey, right alongside kings and queens. Even in death she claimed her place among the royals. But here is what is really interesting. Her tomb is modest. Not grand, not elaborate, not covered in expensive carvings or excessive praise. It is dignified, yes, but understated. The inscription simply identifies her as the daughter of Margaret Tudor, the mother of Lord Darnley, and the grandmother of King James VI of Scotland. That is it. No mention of her 4 imprisonments, her political scheming, her 2 great loves, her survival through 5 reigns. Just her bloodline, just her connections to other people. as if her own life, her own story did not matter as much as who she was related to. And maybe that is appropriate. Because Margaret always understood that her legacy would not be about her, it would be about her descendants. She was playing the long game, remember? She was sacrificing herself so that future generations could succeed. And by that measure, she absolutely won, because 25 years after she died, in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died without children. And who inherited the English throne? King James VI of Scotland, Margaret's beloved grandson, who became King James I of England. Just imagine that moment. If Margaret could have seen it, if she could have been there when James rode south from Scotland to claim the English crown, uniting the two kingdoms that had been enemies for centuries, fulfilling the exact dream she had spent her entire life working toward. How triumphant would that have felt? How vindicated would she have been? But she never got to see it. She died 25 years too early, and that to me is one of the cruelest ironies of her entire story. But let us talk about what actually happened after her death, because that is where the soft erasure begins. Margaret was buried with honour. Her will was executed properly. Her property was distributed according to her wishes, and then slowly, steadily, almost imperceptibly, she started to fade from the historical record. Not completely, not dramatically, but in this quiet, gradual way that is almost worse than being erased entirely. You see, when historians wrote about the Tudor period, they focused on the big names. Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Mary, Queen of Scots, Anne Boleyn. Those are the stories people wanted to read. Those are the characters that sell books and attract attention. Margaret Douglas? She was mentioned, sure, but always as a supporting character, always as the mother of Darnley or the grandmother of James I. Never as the central figure in her own story, and when people did write about her, they often got it wrong. They portrayed her as scheming and manipulative, which she was, but they left out the context. They left out the fact that she was using the only tools available to women in her position. They left out her losses, her grief, her courage. They reduced her to a two-dimensional villain in someone else's narrative rather than seeing her as the complex, fascinating, deeply human person she actually was. There are several reasons why Margaret was forgotten while others were remembered. First, she did not die dramatically. She was not executed like Anne Boleyn or Mary, Queen of Scots. She did not die young and tragic like so many Tudor figures. She died old in her bed of natural causes. And history loves a dramatic death. Martyrs are memorable. People who die of old age, not so much. Second, she was not a queen. She came close, closer than almost anyone who never wore a crown, but close does not count in the history books. Queens get biographies. Almost queens get footnotes. It is unfair, but it is true. Third, and this is crucial, her greatest achievement happened after she was dead. When James became King of England, he got the credit. He was the one who united the crowns, who ended centuries of conflict, who created the foundation for what would eventually become Great Britain. Margaret did all the groundwork, made all the sacrifices, took all the risks, but James got the glory, because he was alive to claim it and she was not. Fourth, she did not leave behind dramatic writings. We have some of her letters, yes, and we have the poetry in the Devonshire manuscript, but we do not have memoirs or manifestos or passionate declarations. Unlike Mary, Queen of Scots, who left behind hundreds of letters that historians have pored over for centuries, Margaret left behind mostly administrative correspondence and a few pieces of poetry from her youth. She left behind actions, not words, and actions are harder to romanticize. But here is what really gets me about Margaret's erasure. It was not malicious. Nobody set out to deliberately forget her. There was no campaign to strike her from the historical record. It just happened naturally, the way it happens to so many women throughout history. They do the work, they make the sacrifices, They change the course of events, and then they fade into the background while the men they supported take center stage. Think about it. How many women in history do you know primarily as the mother of or the wife of rather than by their own accomplishments? How many brilliant, courageous, strategic women have been reduced to supporting roles in stories that should rightfully center them? Margaret Douglas is one of many. She is not unique in being forgotten. She is just one more example of how history has traditionally valued male achievement over female resilience. But does that mean her life did not matter? Absolutely not. Let me tell you why Margaret Douglas's legacy is actually more important than most people realize. First, genetically speaking, she is one of the most successful people in European history. Every single British monarch from James I onward is her direct descendant. King Charles III, who sits on the throne right now in 2024, is descended from Margaret Douglas. So is every other European royal family that has intermarried with the British royals over the centuries. Her DNA is everywhere. If genetic legacy is the measure of success, Margaret crushed it. Second, politically speaking, she helped create the United Kingdom. Yes, the formal political union did not happen until 1707, more than a century after her death. But the groundwork was laid when James inherited both crowns. And that happened because of Margaret's machinations, her strategic marriages, her refusal to give up on her vision even when it seemed hopeless. She saw a future where England and Scotland were not enemies, and she worked her entire life to make that future possible. Third, and this is the part that I think is most overlooked, she proved that women could be political players even in a system designed to exclude them. She was never queen, never held official power, never had a title beyond countess. And yet she influenced the succession of 2 kingdoms. She orchestrated royal marriages. She survived 4 imprisonments and kept fighting. She played the game as well as any man of her era, using different tools but with equal effectiveness. Fourth, she was a survivor. And I know we have talked about this before, but it bears repeating because survival is an underrated achievement. Margaret lived through the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. She saw the English Reformation, the Scottish Reformation, the rise and fall of queens, the execution of family members, the murder of her son and husband. And she kept going. She adapted. She learned. She endured. That is not nothing. That is extraordinary. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret's life asks us to reconsider what we value in historical figures. We tend to valorize the bold, the tragic, the ones who burn bright and fast. We write books and make movies about Anne Boleyn's 3 years as queen. But we forget about Margaret Douglas's 62 years of strategic manoeuvring. We remember Mary, Queen of Scots' dramatic imprisonment and execution, but we forget about Margaret's 4 imprisonments and eventual release. We celebrate the flashy, the dramatic, the aesthetically pleasing tragedies. But what about the quiet victories? What about the long games? What about the people who sacrificed everything for a future they would never see? You know what I think Margaret would say if she could see how history treated her? I think she would shrug and say, "I never did it for the recognition anyway. I did it for my family, I did it for my grandson, I did it because someone had to, and I was the only one in a position to try." Because that is who she was. Not someone seeking glory or fame or historical immortality. Just someone trying to secure a better future for the people she loved. And she succeeded. Just not in a way that made her famous. So here is my question for you. Does it matter if we remember her? Does Margaret Douglas's life have less value because most people have never heard of her? Or is the impact she made on history enough even if her name is not attached to it? I do not have a definitive answer to that, but I do think it is worth asking. Because if we only remember the people who died dramatically or ruled publicly or left behind eloquent writings, we are missing so much of the human story. We are missing the strategists, the survivors, the ones who worked behind the scenes to shape the world. Coming up in our final chapters, we are going to explore this question more deeply. We are going to look at the phenomenon of soft erasure, at why certain people get remembered and others forgotten, and at what Margaret's story tells us about how we value women's contributions to history. We're going to talk about what it means to be the forgotten princess, and whether that is a tragedy or just the natural course of things, because Margaret's story does not end with her death. It ends with us, here, now, deciding whether to remember her or let her fade away again. Vindication is a strange thing when it comes 25 years too late. When you have fought your entire life for something, sacrificed everything for it, endured imprisonment and heartbreak and loss, and then you die without ever seeing it happen. But then, a quarter century later, your vision becomes reality. Your grandson stands in Westminster Abbey, crowned king of not just Scotland but England too. The two kingdoms you tried so desperately to unite are finally brought together under one crown. Everything you dreamed of, schemed for, suffered for actually comes true, just not while you're alive to see it. That was Margaret Douglas's fate. She died in March of 1578, believing probably that her life's work had failed. Yes, her grandson James was King of Scotland, but England was ruled by Elizabeth I, who showed no signs of dying anytime soon, who had made it clear she would never officially name James as her heir, who kept everyone in suspense about the succession right up until her final breath. Margaret went to her grave not knowing if James would ever get the English throne. She could hope, she could believe, but she could not know. And then, on March the 24th, 1603, after 45 years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth I died. She was 69 years old, and she died the way she lived, on her own terms, without a husband, without children, without officially naming a successor until the very end. There are accounts that say on her deathbed, when asked who should inherit the throne, she said something like, "Who but our cousin of Scotland," referring to King James VI. Other accounts say she was too weak to speak and just made a gesture. We will probably never know exactly what happened in that room, but what we do know is this. Within hours of Elizabeth's death, the Privy Council proclaimed James VI of Scotland as James I of England. Can you imagine that moment? After centuries of war, centuries of conflict, centuries of English and Scottish blood spilled on both sides of the border, the two crowns were peacefully united. No invasion, no conquest, just inheritance, just bloodlines, just exactly what Margaret Douglas had been working toward her entire adult life. And it happened because of her. Because she had married Matthew Stewart. Because she had given birth to Darnley. Because Darnley had married Mary, Queen of Scots. Because Mary had given birth to James. The entire chain of events, all the tragedy and triumph led to this moment, and Margaret was not there to see it. James rode south from Scotland to London in April of 1603. It took him over a month because he stopped at every major town along the way, accepting the adulation of his new subjects. People lined the streets to see him. They cheered. They celebrated. England had a king again, for the first time since Henry VIII had died 56 years earlier. And more than that, they had a king who represented unity, who embodied the joining of England and Scotland, who carried the blood of both the Tudors and the Stuarts. Did James think about his grandmother during that ride? Did he remember the letters she had sent him, the advice she'd given, the money she'd provided when he was a struggling young king in Scotland? Did he understand that he owed his position, at least in part, to a woman who had died before he was old enough to really know her? We have no record of him publicly acknowledging Margaret's role in his success, but we do know he honoured her memory in one crucial way. He never forgot he was a Stuart. He never forgot where he came from, and he made sure his descendants remembered too. But let us talk about what Margaret's vindication actually looked like, because it was not just about James becoming king. It was about everything that came after. James went on to rule England and Scotland together for 22 years. He was not the greatest king, let us be honest. He was awkward, scholarly, more interested in theology and hunting than in governance. He made enemies. He survived assassination attempts, most notably the gunpowder plot of 1605, when Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators tried to blow up Parliament with James inside. But he survived. He endured. He passed the crown to his son Charles I, who would eventually be executed during the English Civil War, but that's another story. The point is, the Stuart dynasty that Margaret had worked so hard to establish on the English throne lasted. Not forever. There were interruptions and complications, but her bloodline remained central to British royalty right up to the present day. Every monarch from James I onward has been her descendant. That is vindication on a scale that most people can only dream of. But here is what I find most interesting about Margaret's posthumous vindication. It did not make people remember her. You would think that when James became King of England, someone would have said, "Hey, we should honour his grandmother, the woman who made all this possible." You would think historians would have rushed to write about her, to celebrate her strategic brilliance, to acknowledge her sacrifices, but they did not. Margaret remained a footnote, a mention in passing, the mother of Darnley, the grandmother of James, never the architect of her own destiny. Why? I think there are several reasons, and they tell us a lot about how history works. First, by the time James became king, Margaret had been dead for 25 years. A whole generation had grown up who had never known her, who did not remember her imprisonments or her schemes or her tragedies. She was just a name on a family tree, not a living, breathing person with the story worth telling. Second, James himself did not talk about her much. He focused on his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, who'd been executed by Elizabeth in 1587 and was therefore a martyr, a tragic figure, someone worth commemorating. James had Mary's body moved to Westminster Abbey and gave her an elaborate tomb right next to Elizabeth's, which must have been awkward for both of their ghosts. But Margaret, she already had a tomb at Westminster, and James left it alone. He did not commission grand memorials. He did not write odes to her memory. He just let her rest in obscurity. Third, and this is crucial, Margaret's success was complicated. Yes, she helped put James on the English throne, but she also caused enormous scandal along the way. She had been imprisoned 4 times. Her son had murdered David Riccio. Her son had been murdered himself under mysterious circumstances. Her political machinations had contributed to years of instability and violence. So celebrating Margaret meant acknowledging all of that mess. It was cleaner, simpler to just forget about her and focus on the successful end result. But I want to push back on that logic because I think it misses something important. Margaret's life was messy because life is messy. Her choices were complicated because she was operating in a system that gave her very few good options. She was playing a game where the rules were stacked against her, where every move carried enormous risk, where one wrong step could mean death. And she played it better than almost anyone. The fact that there were casualties along the way, the fact that it was not clean or pretty or noble, does not diminish her achievement. If anything, it makes it more impressive, because she won anyway, despite the odds, despite the obstacles, despite everything. Let me give you a comparison that might make this clearer. Think about how we remember founding fathers in American history. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, these men are celebrated as visionaries, as strategic geniuses, as the architects of a new nation. And they were. But they were also slave owners. They were also involved in violent conflicts. They were also morally compromised in ways that make modern people deeply uncomfortable. And yet, we still honour them. We still teach their stories. We still acknowledge that they shaped history in profound ways, even while acknowledging their flaws. Margaret Douglas deserves the same kind of nuanced recognition. Not hagiography, not uncritical celebration, but honest acknowledgement of what she accomplished within the constraints she faced. She was not a saint, she was not always admirable, but she was effective, she was brilliant, she was resilient, and she changed the course of British history in ways that are still felt today. So what would true vindication for Margaret have looked like? I think it would have looked like this. Her story being taught alongside the stories of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Her strategic genius being acknowledged alongside the political acumen of William Cecil or Thomas Cromwell. Her survival and resilience being celebrated alongside the martyrdom of Anne Boleyn or Mary, Queen of Scots. She should be a major character in the Tudor narrative, not a supporting player. She should be someone every educated person knows about, not an obscure figure that requires a 2-hour bedtime history video to explain. But vindication does not always come in the form we expect or want. Sometimes it is quiet, sometimes it is delayed, sometimes it is incomplete, and sometimes the best we can do is tell the story again, pass it forward to the next generation, and hope that this time it sticks. That is what I am trying to do here. That is what historians like Alison Weir, who wrote the first major biography of Margaret in 2015, are trying to do. We are trying to rescue Margaret Douglas from obscurity, not because she was here, but because her story matters. And here is why it matters. Because there are countless other Margaret Douglases throughout history. Women who shaped events but were written out of the story. Women who made strategic choices but were dismissed as scheming. Women who survived impossible situations but were forgotten because survival is less dramatic than martyrdom. If we can learn to see Margaret clearly, to understand her in all her complexity, maybe we can learn to see those other women too. Maybe we can start telling a more complete version of history, one that includes the strategists and the survivors, not just the kings and the martyrs. But there is one more piece of Margaret's vindication that we need to talk about. One more way her legacy played out after her death. And it is the saddest part of all, because it involves her granddaughter Arabella. Remember her? The baby born while Margaret was imprisoned in the Tower for the 4th time? Well, Arabella grew up to have a claim to the English throne, just like her grandmother. And just like her grandmother, she fell in love with the wrong man and married without royal permission. And just like her grandmother, she was thrown in the Tower of London. Except unlike her grandmother, Arabella never got out. She died in the Tower in 1615 at the age of 39, after going insane from years of solitary confinement. That is Margaret's legacy too. Not just the triumph of James becoming king, but the tragedy of patterns repeating, of lessons unlearned, of the same system that destroyed Margaret's happiness, also destroying Arabella's life. Vindication is never simple. Victory is never clean. And sometimes getting what you wanted comes with a price that future generations have to pay. In our final chapter, we are going to pull all of this together. We are going to talk about what Margaret Douglas's story teaches us about memory, about history, about the price of ambition, and about what it means to be forgotten. We are going to ask whether soft erasure is a tragedy or just the natural order of things, and we are going to decide together whether Margaret deserves to be remembered, because that is the power we have here at the end of her story. We get to choose whether she fades away again or whether we carry her forward. We have reached the end of Margaret Douglas's story. We have walked with her from that freezing castle on the Scottish border where she was born, through childhood abandonment and teenage heartbreak, through 4 imprisonments and 2 great loves, through the murders of her son and husband, through vindication and tragedy and everything in between. And now we are here at the question that started this whole journey. Why did history forget her? Not just forget her a little bit, not just overlook her in favour of more famous figures, but forget her so thoroughly that most people today, even people who love Tudor history, have never heard her name. How does someone so central to the story, someone whose bloodline shaped the future of Britain, someone who survived and strategized and succeeded against impossible odds, just disappear from our collective memory? I have been thinking about this question for hours now, and I think the answer is both simpler and more complicated than we might expect. The simple answer is this: history is written by the winners, and Margaret was not a winner in the traditional sense. She did not conquer territories. She did not rule kingdoms. She did not write revolutionary texts or lead armies into battle. She did not die dramatically enough to become a martyr. She just lived. She endured. She played the long game, and apparently that is not enough to secure your place in the history books. But the complicated answer is more interesting, and it has to do with how we tell stories about the past. We like our historical figures to fit into clear categories: heroes or villains, victims or survivors, queens or commoners. Margaret Douglas does not fit neatly into any of these boxes. She was royal but not a queen. She was a victim of circumstance, but also an active schemer. She was imprisoned 4 times, but she was never executed. She lost the people she loved, but she also achieved her ultimate goal, just not in time to see it. She is complicated, she is messy, she is human in all the ways that make storytelling difficult. And here is what I think is the real reason Margaret was forgotten. She was a woman who wielded power without holding an official position, and history has never quite known what to do with women like that. We know how to remember queens. We have a framework for understanding women who held thrones. Elizabeth I, Mary I, Mary, Queen of Scots. These women fit into a narrative structure we understand. They had titles, they had crowns, they had official power. But Margaret had influence, she had connections, she had intelligence and strategy and the ability to manipulate events from behind the scenes. And that kind of power is harder to quantify, harder to celebrate, and much easier to erase. Because if we acknowledge that Margaret Douglas changed the course of history without ever holding official power, then we have to acknowledge that there might be hundreds or thousands of other women throughout history who did the same thing. And that would require us to completely rewrite how we understand the past. Think about it this way. When you learn about the Tudor period in school, who do you learn about? Henry VIII and his 6 wives, Elizabeth I and her reign, Mary, Queen of Scots and her tragic life. These are the big names, the ones everyone knows. But what about the women who served those queens? What about the mothers and sisters and cousins who shaped events through strategic marriages and careful alliances? What about the women who survived multiple reigns and accumulated knowledge and influence over decades? They are there, in the historical record if you look closely enough. But nobody teaches you about them. Nobody makes movies about them. Nobody writes best-selling novels where they are the main character. Margaret Douglas is one of those women, and her erasure is not unique. It is part of a pattern of valuing public, official male power over private, unofficial female influence. A pattern of remembering the people who died dramatically over the people who lived strategically. A pattern of celebrating tragedy over triumph, especially when that triumph belongs to a woman. But here is where it gets really interesting. This pattern is starting to change. In the last few decades, there has been a surge of interest in forgotten women of history. Historians like Alison Weir, who wrote the first comprehensive biography of Margaret Douglas in 2015, are doing the work of excavating these stories and bringing them back into the light. Podcasts and YouTube channels and documentaries are telling the stories of women who were erased, and audiences are hungry for it. Because we are starting to realize that the history we were taught was incomplete. It was not wrong exactly, but it was selective. It focused on certain kinds of stories and certain kinds of people, and it left out so much. So what does it mean to remember Margaret Douglas now in 2024, more than 440 years after her death? I think it means several things. First, it means acknowledging that the Tudor story is not complete without her. You cannot fully understand how the Stuart dynasty ended up on the English throne without understanding Margaret's role in making that happen. You cannot understand the politics of succession in the 16th century without understanding the women who were navigating those treacherous waters. Margaret is not a footnote. She is a central character, and it is time we treated her like one. Second, it means recognizing that survival is its own kind of heroism. We tend to valorize people who die for their beliefs, who sacrifice themselves for a cause, who go down fighting, and those people are admirable, absolutely. But what about the people who refuse to die? What about the people who endure imprisonment after imprisonment, tragedy after tragedy, and keep getting back up? What about the people who live through the worst that life can throw at them and still find ways to move forward? That is a different kind of courage, a quieter kind, but no less impressive. Third, it means understanding that ambition in women is not automatically a vice. Margaret Douglas was ambitious, incredibly ambitious. She wanted power, status, recognition for her family. She schemed and plotted and took enormous risks to get what she wanted. And for centuries, historians have portrayed that ambition as something negative, something unseemly, something that made her less sympathetic. But why? When men are ambitious, we call them visionaries. We celebrate their strategic thinking. We admire their willingness to take risks. Margaret deserves the same treatment. Her ambition was remarkable. Her strategic intelligence was extraordinary. And the fact that she was willing to fight for what she wanted, even when the odds were against her, makes her more interesting, not less. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, remembering Margaret means remembering that history is full of people like her. Women who shaped events but were written out of the story. People of colour who made contributions but were not given credit. Working-class individuals who changed their communities but were not considered important enough to record, the forgotten, the erased, the overlooked. If we can learn to see Margaret clearly, maybe we can learn to see them too. But I want to be honest with you about something. Remembering Margaret Douglas is not going to change the world. It is not going to solve injustice or erase inequality or fix the problems of the present. What it can do, though, is change how we think about the past. It can expand our understanding of who gets to be important, whose stories matter, what counts as historical significance. And that matters, because the stories we tell about the past shape how we understand the present and imagine the future. When young girls learn about history and only see queens and martyrs, they learn a very specific lesson about what it takes for a woman to be remembered. You have to be at the very top, or you have to die dramatically, or you do not matter. But when they learn about women like Margaret Douglas, women who were never queens but still changed history, women who survived and strategized and played the long game, they learn something different. They learn that there are many ways to be powerful, many ways to make a difference, many ways to matter. And maybe that is Margaret's real legacy. Not just the bloodline she created, although that is significant. Not just the political changes she helped bring about, although those are important. But the example she set of a woman who refused to accept the limitations placed on her, who found ways to wield power within a system designed to exclude her, who survived everything the 16th century could throw at her and still achieved her goals. That is a legacy worth remembering. So here is what I want you to take away from Margaret's story. Life is going to knock you down multiple times in ways that feel impossible to survive. You're going to lose people you love. You're going to face obstacles that seem insurmountable. You're going to be told, explicitly or implicitly, that you do not matter, that your dreams are too big, that you should accept your place and stop fighting. And in those moments, I want you to remember Margaret Douglas. Remember that she was imprisoned 4 times and released 4 times. Remember that she loved and loved again. Remember that she had a vision for the future that seemed impossible, and she worked toward it anyway, even though she never got to see it realized. Remember that she survived, and she won, eventually. Your victory might not look the way you expected. It might come too late for you to fully appreciate it. It might be complicated and messy and incomplete. But that does not make it any less real. Margaret Douglas changed British history forever, even though most people have forgotten her name, and you can change your corner of the world too, even if nobody writes your name in the history books. The work still matters, the fight still matters, you still matter, and maybe, just maybe, if enough of us start telling these forgotten stories, start remembering the overlooked and the erased, we can change not just how we understand the past, but how we build the future. A future where all kinds of stories are valued, where all kinds of power are recognized, where survival is celebrated as much as sacrifice, where women like Margaret Douglas are not forgotten, but remembered as the remarkable, complicated, thoroughly human people they were. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to carry Margaret with you. Think about her strength, her resilience, her refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. Think about the fact that she lived through 5 Tudor reigns, survived 4 imprisonments, endured the murders of her son and husband, and still managed to see her bloodline secure the future she had always dreamed of. Think about the fact that 446 years after her death we are still here, telling her story, refusing to let her fade away completely. That is the power of remembering. That is the power of storytelling. That is the power we all have to decide who gets forgotten and who gets carried forward. And tonight, we chose Margaret Douglas. We chose to remember her, to honor her, to acknowledge that her life mattered and her story deserves to be told. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for spending these hours learning about a woman who most of the world has forgotten. Thank you for listening to her story with open hearts and open minds. I hope it has moved you, challenged you, made you think differently about history and memory and what it means to matter. And if you found value in Margaret's story, I invite you to share it. Tell someone else about the forgotten Tudor princess. Comment below about what surprised you, what moved you, what you will remember. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more forgotten stories, more hidden histories, more tales of remarkable people who changed the world without getting the credit they deserved. Because there are so many more stories to tell. So many more forgotten women and men and people whose lives deserve to be remembered. And I will be here every week bringing them to you, pulling them out of obscurity and into the light. So stay with me, keep listening, keep learning, keep remembering. Margaret Douglas's story ends here, but the questions it raises, the lessons it teaches, the inspiration it offers, those will stay with you long after you close your eyes tonight. Sleep well, my friends, and dream of a world where no one's story is forgotten, where everyone who fought and survived and loved and lost gets their moment to be remembered, where soft erasure is replaced with loud celebration. Until next time, keep their stories alive. Good night.